In December 1945, a farmer near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi was digging for fertilizer in the dry soil near some limestone cliffs. His name was Muhammad Ali al-Samman, and what his spade hit that day wasn't nitrogen-rich soil. It was a sealed clay jar buried for over 1,500 years. Inside that jar were books, ancient books, bound in leather, written in a language most people today have never heard of. And one of those books would eventually force scholars, historians and theologians to ask a question they thought had been settled centuries ago. What if we don't actually know the full story of how early Christians understood Jesus? What if one of his own disciples wrote something down that the Church spent almost 2,000 years trying to erase? That book is called the Gospel of Thomas, and here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. There's no crucifixion in it, no trial before Pilate, no crown of thorns, no resurrection, no empty tomb, no angel rolling away a stone. If you stripped away everything you think you know about the Gospels, the sequence of betrayal, death and rising again that defines Christianity for billions of people, and asked what's left, the Gospel of Thomas is kind of the answer. It's just sayings. 114 of them, one after another, attributed directly to Jesus, with almost no narrative connecting them at all. No birth story, no miracles described in detail, no timeline. Just voice after voice after voice, like someone transcribed a conversation and threw away everything except the words themselves. Now you might be thinking, okay, so it's just a list of quotes. Big deal. But some of these sayings are strange. Genuinely strange. They talk about a kingdom that isn't coming in the future, but is somehow already here, hidden in plain sight. They talk about finding an image that existed before humanity was even created. They talk about making two into one, about entering a place where there's no male and female, about a light that was there before the world came into being. This isn't the Jesus of Christmas pageants and Easter sermons. This is something else, something that reads less like a biography and more like a puzzle, one that seems to be pointing toward a completely different account of how humanity began and what it's actually here for. So the question we're going to sit with in this investigation is simple to ask and incredibly hard to answer. Does the Gospel of Thomas preserve an alternate vision of humanity's origin, one buried by the desert sand for 16 centuries and buried by the Church for even longer before that? Or is it something else entirely? A later invention, a mystical reinterpretation, a text that tells us more about the group that wrote it than about Jesus himself? We're not going to jump to conclusions here. This is a topic where a lot of channels love to throw around words like suppressed and secret and banned without ever explaining what the actual evidence says. We're going to do this properly. We'll look at where the text came from, what scholars actually know versus what they're guessing, why the four Gospels you grew up with look nothing like this one, and why the early church, when it had the chance, chose to leave Thomas out of the Bible entirely. Evidence first, speculation clearly labelled as speculation. That's the deal. Before we go further, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is right there. I get comments from people in Manila at midnight, Toronto at lunch, all listening to the same words at completely different moments. And honestly, that never stops being kind of amazing to me. And if you're enjoying these deep dives, the best way to support the channel is to follow the show on Spotify. Listen there. And if you've got a minute, leave a 5-star review. Links in the description. Now, let's go back to the Egyptian desert and the strange jar that started all of this. Let's actually slow down and look closely at what happened in that Egyptian desert, because the story of the discovery itself is almost as strange as the book it produced. Nag Hammadi is a town in Upper Egypt, sitting along the Nile, hundreds of miles south of Cairo. In December 1945, the landscape around it was mostly farmland. Cut through by cliffs made of soft limestone, the kind that erodes into caves and hollows over thousands of years. Local farmers regularly dug into the base of these cliffs, looking for sabak, a nitrogen-rich soil that formed from centuries of decomposing organic material and worked beautifully as fertilizer. It was backbreaking, unremarkable work. People had been doing it in that same spot for generations without finding anything more interesting than dirt. Muhammad Ali al-Saman was one of those farmers, and depending on which version of the story you read, and there are several versions, his spade either struck a large sealed jar buried near a boulder, or he and his brothers had already been digging around that boulder for another reason entirely. Some later accounts even suggest a blood feud was involved, that Muhammad Ali and his family were in the area avenging a relative's murder and only stumbled onto the jar in the process. It's the kind of detail that sounds almost too dramatic to be true, and scholars have never been able to fully confirm it. Muhammad Ali gave interviews decades after the fact, and his memory, understandably, wasn't always consistent. People rarely remember the exact sequence of events from 40 years ago with perfect clarity, especially when the event in question seemed unimportant at the time. What we do know with more confidence is that the jar was large, made of clay, and sealed. And here's where the story takes its first strange turn. According to Muhammad Ali's later account, he almost didn't break it open. He was reportedly nervous the jar might contain a jinn, a spirit, something dangerous best left undisturbed. But greed or curiosity, or maybe just the hope that it held gold, apparently won out. He smashed it open with his mattock. What spilled out wasn't gold, and it wasn't a spirit. It was books. 13 leather-bound papyrus codices, their pages fragile and centuries old, more books than you'd expect a farmer to know what to do with. Now, if you're picturing this discovery being handled with white gloves and careful documentation, forget it. This wasn't an archaeological excavation. Nobody was standing there with a camera and a notebook cataloguing provenance. This was a farmer looking at a pile of old books he didn't understand, in a language he couldn't read, with no idea what he'd found. Some of the material may have been damaged or lost in these first chaotic days. There are accounts, again disputed, that Muhammad Ali's mother burned some of the papyrus pages for cooking fuel, not realizing what she was destroying. If true, and we can't know for certain how much was lost this way, it means part of this ancient library was reduced to ash before anyone outside that household even knew it existed. It's a genuinely painful thought if you care about history at all. Somewhere out there, sayings and texts that might have added even more pieces to this puzzle may have gone up in smoke over a cooking fire in rural Egypt. From there, the books entered a kind of underground journey that took years to sort out. Muhammad Ali, wary of authorities and worried about being connected to the ongoing blood feud, didn't report the find. Instead, the codices moved through local hands, sold, traded, split apart. Some went to a Coptic priest. Some passed through antiquities dealers in Cairo. One codex reportedly ended up smuggled out of Egypt entirely, crossing through Belgium before eventually being purchased and studied in Europe. That particular volume became known as the Jung Codex, named after the psychologist Carl Jung, whose foundation acquired it. Meanwhile, the Egyptian government eventually intervened, and most of the remaining material was placed under the control of the Coptic Museum in Cairo. It took years, sometimes decades, for scholars to gain full access to everything, to photograph it properly, to begin the slow work of translation. Political instability in Egypt during this period didn't help. Neither did rivalries between competing scholars, some of whom guarded access to pages almost jealously, slowing down publication of the full collection. It wasn't until the 1970s, nearly 30 years after Muhammad Ali first cracked open that jar, that a complete facsimile edition of what became known as the Nag Hammadi library was finally made available to researchers around the world. Think about that gap, 30 years between discovery and full scholarly access. In a fast-moving information age, that timeline seems almost unbelievable. But that's how tangled the path from desert soil to university library actually was. So what exactly had Muhammad Ali found? Once scholars got their hands on the material, they realized this wasn't just a random assortment of old religious writing. It was a genuine library, or at least the remains of one, containing over 50 separate texts bound into those 13 codices. And the language was Coptic, an Egyptian language written using a modified Greek alphabet, heavily used by Egyptian Christians in the centuries following the introduction of Christianity into Egypt. Most of these texts weren't originally composed in Coptic, though. They were translations made from earlier Greek originals, which meant the ideas inside them were often older, sometimes much older, than the physical pages themselves. And the content of this library was frankly staggering for historians of early Christianity. These weren't copies of the four Gospels everybody already knew. These were Gospels, apocalypses, secret teachings, and theological treatises that had essentially vanished from history, texts referenced occasionally by early church writers, who condemned them as heretical, but which modern scholars assumed were lost forever, destroyed sometime in antiquity, along with the movements that produced them. Suddenly here they were intact, buried not through some grand conspiracy of preservation, but likely because someone, maybe a monk facing pressure from church authorities cracking down on unapproved texts, decided to hide these books rather than destroy them. Nobody knows exactly who buried that jar or precisely why, but the leading theory among scholars is that it was an act of protection, an attempt to save these writings from official condemnation and destruction, sometime in the 4th or 5th century, when orthodoxy was tightening its grip on what counted as acceptable Christian belief. Among those 50-plus texts sat one document that would go on to generate more academic debate, more popular fascination, and more theological controversy than almost anything else in the entire collection. The Gospel of Thomas. It wasn't the longest text in the library. It wasn't the most elaborate or the most obviously mystical. But it was in many ways the most consequential, because unlike some of the denser philosophical treatises buried alongside it, Thomas presented itself in a form everyone could immediately recognize. Sayings of Jesus, direct, first-person quotations, attributed straight to the man himself. That familiarity is exactly what made it so disruptive. This wasn't some obscure cosmological system full of unfamiliar names and invented mythology. This looked like it belonged in the same category as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that resemblance, combined with its glaring differences, is precisely what forced scholars to start asking uncomfortable questions. Before Nag Hammadi, our understanding of early Christian diversity relied almost entirely on second-hand accounts, quotes and condemnations preserved by orthodox writers describing groups and beliefs they considered dangerous. It was a little like trying to understand a foreign culture only through the writings of its harshest critics. Now, for the first time in over a millennium, historians had primary sources, actual texts in something close to their original form, written by the communities themselves rather than filtered through their opponents. That shift alone transformed the study of early Christianity almost overnight. So, when we talk about the Gospel of Thomas, we're not talking about some text that was always sitting in plain sight, waiting to be reconsidered. We're talking about a document that vanished from active circulation for roughly 16 centuries, buried in an Egyptian jar, nearly destroyed by fire, passed hand to hand through antiquities markets, and finally pieced together by scholars working across international borders and academic rivalries. And now that we know how it got to us, it's time to actually open it up and ask what it says, and why those sayings turned out to be quite so unsettling. The first thing to understand is that the Gospel of Thomas is not a gospel in the way most people mean the word. If you open Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, you enter a story. Jesus is born or introduced at the Jordan River. He travels from town to town. He gathers disciples, heals the sick, argues with religious authorities, performs signs, enters Jerusalem, is arrested, crucified, and in the Christian account rises from the dead. Even where those 4 books disagree on details, they all move through a recognizable narrative. There is a beginning, a middle, and an ending. There is a plot. Thomas has none of that. No Bethlehem, no manger, no baptism in the Jordan. No 12 disciples receiving a formal call beside the sea. No feeding of the 5,000, no walking on water. No trial before Pilate, no cross, no empty tomb, no resurrection appearance. In fact, Thomas never directly tells you what happened to Jesus at all. Instead, it gives you 114 sayings, one after another. Usually they begin with a simple formula, Jesus said. Then comes a sentence, a short exchange, a parable, a riddle, an instruction, sometimes something that sounds completely familiar, and sometimes something that sounds like it was designed to make you stop reading and stare at the wall for an hour. That is why scholars call it a sayings gospel. It is a collection of teachings attributed to Jesus, without the narrative framework that surrounds Jesus in the canonical gospels. Think of it less like a biography and more like a box of fragments. 114 pieces laid out without much explanation, without a map telling you how they connect, and without any obvious agreement about what order you're supposed to understand them in. The text opens with a title that immediately tells us what kind of book this is trying to be. In one common translation it reads, "These are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke, and Didymos Judas Thomas recorded." That sentence is doing a lot of work. First, these are not merely sayings, they are secret sayings. Or, depending on how you translate the Greek idea behind the Coptic wording, hidden sayings, that does not necessarily mean they were meant to be concealed from every ordinary person forever, like a code locked inside a vault. But it does suggest that their meaning is not obvious on the surface. You do not simply hear them once, nod politely, and move on. You have to seek. You have to interpret. You may have to become a different kind of person before you can understand what they are saying. Second, Jesus here is called the living Jesus, not Jesus of Nazareth walking through Galilee in a historical sequence of events. Not Jesus hanging on a cross, not even, explicitly, the risen Jesus appearing after death. The emphasis is different. He is living, present, speaking. The source of words that, according to the text, still have the power to reveal something hidden about reality and about the reader. And then there is the name attached to the collection, Didymos Judas Thomas. For modern readers, that can sound like 3 separate names piled awkwardly together. But the strange part becomes clearer once you know what Didymos means. Didymos is Greek for twin. Thomas comes from an Aramaic word that also means twin. So the opening credits this text to someone whose name effectively says, Twin Judas Twin. That is not an accident. In later Christian tradition, this figure became known as Thomas the Apostle, the disciple remembered in the Gospel of John as Doubting Thomas, the man who refuses to believe reports of Jesus' resurrection until he sees the wounds for himself. But the Gospel of Thomas does not introduce him that way. It does not tell his story, it gives him a title loaded with symbolism, the twin. Twin of whom? The obvious answer in some later Syrian Christian traditions was Jesus. Thomas was imagined not as Jesus' biological twin in any straightforward historical sense, but as a spiritual double, someone uniquely close to him, someone capable of receiving teachings others could not. In some ancient texts outside the New Testament, Thomas is even called the twin of Jesus in a direct and dramatic way. Whether the author of this gospel meant that literally symbolically, or simply inherited the name from a tradition we can no longer fully reconstruct, is debated. But the effect is hard to miss before the first saying even begins. The text creates an atmosphere of intimacy and secrecy. Jesus speaks, the twin records, and the reader is invited into a conversation that seems to exist just behind the familiar public story. Then comes saying 1, and he said, "Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death." That is a wild opening claim. Not whoever memorizes the sayings, not whoever obeys a list of commandments. Whoever finds their interpretation, the text announces almost immediately that its words are puzzles. Their meaning must be found, and finding it has consequences nothing less than life over death. Now, it would be easy to hear that and imagine every line in Thomas is bizarre, alien, completely detached from the Christianity people already know. But that is not what the text is like. One of the reasons Thomas has fascinated scholars so intensely is that much of it sounds familiar. You find sayings that resemble material in Matthew and Luke. The harvest is plentiful, but the labourers are few. A city built on a high hill cannot be hidden. A prophet is not accepted in his own town. Seek and you will find. There are parables about a mustard seed, a sower scattering seed, a man discovering treasure hidden in a field, a rich fool who stores up wealth and dies before enjoying it. If you grew up hearing the canonical Gospels, parts of Thomas can feel almost uncannily recognizable. Then, without warning, the ground shifts. Jesus says, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. If you do not have that within you, what you do not have within you will kill you." He says, "When you make the two one, and when you make the inner like the outer, and the outer like the inner, then you will enter the kingdom." He says, "I am not your master. Because you have drunk, you have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring that I have measured out." And perhaps most famously, he says, "Let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds." When he finds, he will be disturbed. When he is disturbed, he will marvel, and he will reign over all. That does not sound like a neat collection of moral advice. It sounds more like a spiritual obstacle course. Every saying seems to ask the reader, do you really understand what you think you understand? Are you ready to have your assumptions overturned? What if the kingdom is not somewhere you go after death, but something you fail to see because it is already present? The Gospel of Thomas moves between these different registers constantly. A familiar proverb might sit beside an obscure mystical statement. A parable that resembles Matthew might be followed by a saying with no clear parallel anywhere else. Sometimes Jesus speaks to a group. Sometimes he speaks privately to disciples. Sometimes the sayings are short and sharp enough to fit on a modern quote card. Other times they unfold into verbal mazes involving light, images, unity, poverty, nakedness, children, and the strange reversal of everything people assume about the world. And crucially, Thomas does not pause to explain itself. The canonical Gospels often guide the reader. They tell you where Jesus is, who is listening, why a conflict matters, and occasionally what a parable means. Thomas strips almost all of that away. No geography. Almost no chronology, very little setting. The sayings appear with just enough context to be intelligible, and sometimes not even that much. You are left alone with the words, "That may be the point." But before we start treating this as a direct transcript of secret conversations from the historical Jesus, we need to be careful about what survives and what does not. The complete Gospel of Thomas that people read today comes from the Nag Hammadi library. It was copied in Coptic, probably sometime in the 4th century. Coptic was the final stage of the ancient Egyptian language. written mostly with Greek letters. So the manuscript discovered in that clay jar is not an original copy written by Thomas's own hand. It is a much later handwritten translation, produced centuries after Jesus lived. That does not make it worthless. Far from it. Nearly every ancient text reaches us through copies, often copies of copies of copies. But it means we have to separate the age of the surviving manuscript from the age of the work itself. The papyrus pages at Nag Hammadi are late antique. The collection of sayings they preserve may be older. How much older, and in what form, is where the real argument begins. Because Thomas was not entirely unknown before 1945. Decades before the Nag Hammadi discovery, archaeologists working at Oxyrhynchus, an ancient Egyptian city buried beneath desert sand, found a handful of Greek papyrus fragments containing sayings attributed to Jesus. At first, nobody knew exactly what they belonged to, but after the Coptic Gospel of Thomas emerged from Nag Hammadi, scholars recognized that several of those fragments preserved parts of the same text. That matters enormously. The Nag Hammadi version is in Coptic, but those smaller fragments are in Greek, the language in which many early Christian writings circulated, and they are older than the surviving Coptic manuscript, usually dated somewhere around the late 2nd or early 3rd century. They do not preserve all 114 sayings. They are only scraps, but they provide a glimpse of Thomas in an earlier linguistic form, and they raise a question that has never gone away. Was the Gospel of Thomas originally written in Greek? Was it translated from Syriac or another Semitic language? Did the Greek fragments preserve an earlier version with slightly different wording? And if Thomas changed as it passed from community to community, copyist to copyist, language to language, what did its earliest form actually look like? That is where the mystery deepens, because the book in our hands is not just a strange gospel. It is a surviving endpoint of a long chain of transmission, and somewhere behind those Coptic pages and broken Greek scraps may stand an earlier text, shaped in the volatile first centuries of Christianity, when the memory of Jesus was still being collected, argued over, expanded, and transformed. Now we can look more closely at those scraps from Oxyrhynchus. Because they are small, really small, not a complete book, not even one complete chapter by modern standards. A few torn pieces of papyrus, their edges broken away, their lines interrupted, their words sometimes missing exactly where we most want an answer. But in the study of ancient texts, a scrap can change everything. Oxyrhynchus was an Egyptian city southwest of Cairo, once crowded, wealthy, and intensely Greek-speaking. For centuries, its people threw away old documents, letters, tax records, shopping lists, legal contracts, and worn-out books in rubbish dumps outside the city. Then the desert did something remarkable. It preserved them. Beginning in the late 19th century, archaeologists Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt excavated these ancient rubbish heaps and uncovered papyri by the hundreds of thousands. Most were ordinary documents, but mixed into the debris were pieces of lost literature, including early Christian writings. In 1897 they found the first of the Thomas fragments. Then more appeared. Today, 3 papyri are generally connected with the Gospel of Thomas: Papyrus Oxyrhynchus I, 654 and 655. Their dates are debated within a range, as ancient manuscript dates often are, but they are usually placed around the late 2nd century or early 3rd century. That makes them older than the surviving Coptic manuscript from Nag Hammadi by at least a century, possibly more. And unlike Nag Hammadi Thomas, they are written in Greek. That immediately sounds like the answer to the mystery. Greek fragments came first. The Coptic manuscript came later. Therefore Thomas was originally Greek, but ancient history almost never lets us solve a puzzle that easily. The Greek fragments preserve portions of sayings that also appear in the Coptic Gospel of Thomas. One contains material corresponding to sayings about seeing the speck in another person's eye while ignoring the beam in your own. Another preserves sayings about the kingdom, the harvest, the worries of the body, and a prophet not being accepted in his own homeland. Another begins with part of the title and several of the opening sayings. When scholars compared them after Nag Hammadi was discovered, the connection was unmistakable. These were not merely similar sayings floating around in the early Christian world. They belonged to Thomas, or at least to a text extremely close to Thomas. That was a major discovery because it showed that Thomas had circulated before the 4th century Coptic copy was made. It had been read, copied and passed around in Greek-speaking Egypt generations earlier. But then the differences started to matter. Sometimes the Greek wording is very close to the Coptic. You can see the same basic saying moving from one language to another, the same image, the same instruction, the same strange turn of phrase. Other times, though, the Greek seems longer, or the Coptic seems longer. A phrase appears in one version but not the other. A line has been rearranged, a saying ends differently. Words that look like simple equivalents can carry different shades of meaning. And those differences create a problem. Imagine you have a song that survives in 2 old recordings. The melody is obviously the same. The verses are mostly the same. But one singer repeats a line, the other skips. One version uses light, the other uses fire. One places a verse before the chorus, the other after it. Are you hearing 2 copies of one original song, or are you hearing 2 performances from a tradition that was still changing? That is the question with Thomas. The fragments can establish some things. They establish that sayings associated with Thomas existed in Greek before the Nag Hammadi manuscript. They establish that the Coptic text was not invented whole cloth by a 4th century Egyptian scribe. They show that at least part of Thomas had a textual history reaching back into the 2nd or 3rd century. But they cannot establish the exact date when Thomas was first composed. They cannot prove that every saying in the Coptic collection was present from the beginning. They cannot tell us whether the Greek copies represent the original version, a translation from an earlier Syriac text, or simply another branch of the same evolving tradition. And they definitely cannot tell us that Thomas was written by the Apostle Thomas. A manuscript can preserve an old tradition without preserving its original author. Think of it like finding a 19th century copy of an old folk tale. It proves the tale existed by the 19th century. It may preserve much older material, but it does not tell you who first told it around a fire, or how many generations reshaped it before anyone wrote it down. The language question makes the mystery even deeper. Greek was the international language of the Eastern Mediterranean. It was the language of cities, trade, administration, philosophy, and many early Christian writings. The New Testament was written in Greek, so a Greek Thomas makes perfect sense. But Thomas also has connections that some scholars see as Syrian. Its association with the Apostle Thomas is especially strong in Syrian Christian tradition. Its name Thomas comes from Aramaic and means twin. Some of its wordplay and unusual phrasing may make more sense. Scholars argue if they stand behind a Semitic language like Syriac or Aramaic. That has led to several competing theories. Maybe Thomas was first composed in Greek, then translated into Coptic for the community that copied the Nag Hammadi book. Maybe it was first composed in Syriac, then translated independently into Greek and Coptic. Maybe there was no single, neat original at all. Maybe a core collection of sayings circulated orally and in writing, gathering additions and changes as it moved through different communities. This last possibility can feel unsettling. We like originals. We want the first copy, the clean version, the moment before anyone changed anything. We want to find the text exactly as its author released it into the world, but ancient literature did not always work that way. A sayings collection is especially likely to shift. Individual sayings can travel independently, a teacher's words can be remembered in different forms, a scribe can clarify a difficult phrase, accidentally skip a line, combine two related sayings, or add a familiar expression from another gospel tradition. Translation itself can do something similar. A word in Greek may have several meanings in Coptic. A translator has to choose, and once that choice is written down, it can shape how every later reader understands Jesus' words. Take the opening description, secret sayings or hidden sayings. Those are not identical ideas. Secret can suggest restricted knowledge, something deliberately concealed. Hidden can suggest something present but unnoticed, like treasure buried in a field. The difference may be subtle, but Thomas is built on subtle differences. Its entire spiritual world depends on whether truth is being withheld from you or waiting for you to see it. So when someone says, "The Greek fragments prove what Thomas originally said," the honest answer is, not quite. They give us an earlier window. They do not give us the whole room. What they reveal is not a single straight line from Jesus to Thomas to Nag Hammadi. They reveal a living textual tradition, Greek copies in one place, a Coptic translation in another, similar sayings but not always identical, a text moving across languages, regions and generations, changing just enough to make certainty difficult. And that may be the most important clue of all, because before we can ask whether Thomas preserves early memories of Jesus, we have to ask what Thomas even means. Is it one book written once, a collection revised over time, a Greek text translated into Coptic, a Syrian tradition wearing Greek clothes, or a network of sayings that kept being gathered, interpreted, and rewritten by people who believed they contained a truth too important to lose? The fragments do not end the mystery. They show us how old the mystery really is. So who was Thomas? The name appears in the New Testament, but not in the way most people expect. Thomas does not dominate the story the way Peter does. He does not deliver a sermon at Pentecost. He does not write a letter that became part of the Bible. In the first 3 Gospels, he is mostly a name in a list. One of the 12 present but quiet. Then comes the Gospel of John, and suddenly Thomas becomes unforgettable. After Jesus is raised according to John, the disciples say they have seen him. Thomas is not there. When they tell him, he refuses to accept it. He says he will not believe unless he sees the wounds himself, unless he puts his finger where the nails were and his hand into Jesus' side. That is where the phrase doubting Thomas comes from. But that label can be misleading. Thomas is not simply the disciple who doubts. He is also the disciple who makes one of the strongest confessions in the entire New Testament. When the risen Jesus appears to him, Thomas answers, "My Lord and my God." So Thomas carries 2 identities at once. He is the one who demands to see, and he is the one who, when he sees, says more than anyone else. That combination matters. A figure associated with doubt, direct encounter, hidden knowledge, and a dramatic recognition of Jesus would become a powerful name for later Christians, especially for Christians who believed that ordinary belief was not enough. That truth had to be found, seen, understood, discovered from within, and the Gospel of Thomas begins by claiming exactly that kind of authority. These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke and Didymus Judas Thomas recorded. That name is stranger than it first appears. Thomas is not originally a personal name in the ordinary sense. It comes from an Aramaic word meaning twin. Didymos is the Greek word for twin. So the opening title effectively calls him Twin Judas Thomas. Twin, twin, Judas Thomas, why repeat it? Maybe it is just translation. A Semitic title carried into Greek. Maybe the author wanted readers in different language worlds to understand the name. But the repetition also creates an atmosphere. Thomas is not merely Thomas. He is the twin, the double, the one somehow paired with Jesus or close enough to him to preserve words others did not hear. Later Syrian traditions pushed that idea even further. In texts such as the Acts of Thomas, probably written centuries after Jesus, Thomas becomes the apostle sent east. He travels beyond the Roman world. He preaches in India. He performs miracles. He converts kings and merchants. He confronts rulers, escapes prisons, and eventually dies as a martyr. These stories are dramatic. They are also difficult to treat as straightforward biography. There may well have been early Christian connections between the Eastern Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, Persia, and India. Trade routes linked these worlds. People, goods, languages, and religious ideas moved farther than we sometimes imagine. And ancient Christian communities in India have long preserved traditions connecting their origins to Thomas. But the detailed stories we possess were written later. They reflect devotion, memory, theology, and legend mixed together. They tell us that Thomas became enormously important in Eastern Christianity. They do not allow us to reconstruct his life step by step with confidence. That is the problem every time we ask whether an apostle wrote an ancient gospel. The historical Thomas may have been a real disciple of Jesus. Most scholars would not find that unlikely. He appears in multiple early apostle lists, and there is no obvious reason to think the name was invented from nothing. But beyond that, the ground becomes thin very quickly. We do not have letters in Thomas's own hand. We do not have a first-century biography written by someone who knew him. We do not have a manuscript of the Gospel of Thomas saying, "I watched Jesus say these words, and I wrote them down immediately." What we have is a text that claims the authority of Thomas. And in the ancient world, that is not the same thing as modern authorship. Today, if a book says it was written by a famous person, we usually assume one of two possibilities. Either that person wrote it, or someone forged the name. But ancient literary culture was messier than that. A text could be attached to a revered teacher because it preserved that teacher's tradition, or because it came from a community that claimed to follow that teacher, or because the name signalled a particular interpretation of the faith. A book, according to someone, could mean more than typed personally by that individual. It could mean, this is the teaching as we received it. This is the memory we protect. This is the authority we stand under. Early Christian literature is full of famous names. Gospels of Peter, Philip, Mary, Judas. Secret books attributed to James, John, or other apostles. Some may preserve ancient traditions. Some were almost certainly written long after the people whose names they carry. But the name was never random. It was a claim, a way of saying, listen to this. This comes from close to the beginning. Think of it like a movement years after its founder has died. Different groups remember the founder differently. One emphasizes compassion, another emphasizes strict discipline. Another claims to preserve the founder's private teaching, the words spoken not to crowds but to the inner circle. Eventually, a text appears under the founder's name, or under the name of a trusted disciple. The name gives the tradition a face. Thomas may have been that face for communities in Syria or eastern Mesopotamia. Some scholars have argued that the Gospel of Thomas emerged from a Syrian Christian environment, where Thomas was already remembered as a major apostolic authority. Others are more cautious. The surviving evidence does not let us identify one single Thomas community, one city, or one group of people who definitely produced the text. But the connection is not hard to understand. Thomas was associated with the East. Thomas was associated with hidden sayings. Thomas was associated with the twin, and Thomas in the Gospel of John was associated with the need to move from hearing to seeing. That makes him an almost perfect patron for a sayings collection that repeatedly tells its readers to seek, find, recognize, and understand. But there is one more complication. The Thomas who appears in the Gospel of Thomas is not really a character. He does not walk through Galilee. He does not ask Jesus questions in most of the sayings. He does not narrate events. He does not explain where he was when the words were spoken. His name appears at the entrance, then almost disappears. That tells us something important. The Gospel of Thomas is not trying to give us Thomas's autobiography. It is not even especially interested in Thomas as a human being. Thomas functions as a literary voice, a witness name, a seal placed on a collection of sayings. Behind that seal may stand real memories, oral traditions, communities that treasured particular teachings of Jesus. Perhaps some sayings that circulated very early, perhaps others shaped by later reflection. But the title alone cannot sort them for us. So did Thomas write it? The honest answer is that we cannot prove he did, and most scholars think direct apostolic authorship is unlikely. The text seems to belong to a later period of collection, transmission, editing, and interpretation. It may contain older material, it may preserve traditions linked directly or indirectly to people who knew the earliest Jesus movement. But that is very different from saying the apostle himself sat down and composed the book as we have it. The historical Thomas remains partly hidden, the literary Thomas stands at the doorway. And the next question is the one that changes the entire mystery. If the apostle probably did not write the Gospel of Thomas in its surviving form, then when did this collection of buried sayings first begin to take shape? That question sounds like it should have a simple answer. Find the oldest manuscript, read the date, problem solved. But ancient texts do not work like that. The copy of the Gospel of Thomas found at Nag Hammadi was written in Coptic sometime around the 4th century. That tells us when one surviving copy was made. It does not tell us when the Gospel of Thomas was first composed. A manuscript is not a birth certificate. It is more like a photograph of a river taken at one moment in time. You can see where the water is now. You cannot automatically see every stream that flowed into it. And Thomas may have had many streams. Most scholars place the final form of the Gospel of Thomas somewhere between the 1st century and the 2nd century. But that range hides a serious argument, not a minor disagreement over a few years. A debate about what kind of book Thomas is, where it came from, and whether some of its sayings may bring us surprisingly close to the earliest Jesus traditions. One possibility is that Thomas began taking shape very early, perhaps in the second half of the 1st century, while memories of Jesus were still being repeated in small communities across the eastern Mediterranean and Syria. On this view, Thomas may preserve sayings that circulated independently before the 4 canonical Gospels reached their final written forms, or at least alongside them. The argument starts with the structure of the book. Thomas is mostly sayings, short statements, parables, riddles, commands, questions and answers. It does not spend time telling readers where Jesus went, who was watching, what day it was, or what happened next. In some cases, a saying appears with almost no context at all. Jesus says something. The reader is left to wrestle with it. That can look primitive in the historical sense. Not primitive as in simple or unsophisticated. Thomas is often extremely difficult, but primitive as in earlier, closer to oral tradition. A saying remembered because it was striking, repeated because it was useful, passed from teacher to student, house to house, village to village, long before anyone decided to build a narrative around it. Think about how famous words survive. A person may say something unforgettable, At first, people repeat the line by itself. Years later, someone remembers the circumstances. Decades later, a biographer places it inside a larger story. The saying can be older than the book that finally records it. Some scholars think that is what happened with parts of Thomas. There are sayings in Thomas that resemble material in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. A farmer scatters seed. A shepherd searches for a lost sheep. A tiny mustard seed becomes something large. A pearl merchant gives up everything for one thing of overwhelming value. These kinds of sayings have the sharpness of oral teaching. They are memorable. They are built to be repeated. And sometimes Thomas gives them in a shorter or stranger form than the canonical Gospels. That matters because some scholars have argued that the shorter form may be closer to an earlier version. Maybe Matthew and Luke expanded a saying for their own audiences. Maybe Thomas preserved a version before it was woven into larger stories about Jesus' ministry, death, and resurrection. But here is the problem. Shorter does not automatically mean older. A later editor can cut a story down just as easily as an earlier tradition can preserve it in brief form. If you find two versions of the same speech, one long and one short, you cannot just assume the short one came first. Someone may have summarized it. Someone may have removed details. Someone may have reshaped it to fit a new theological message. And that leads to the other side of the debate. Many scholars date the Gospel of Thomas later, often to the middle or latter part of the 2nd century. They see it not as an independent window into the earliest Jesus movement, but as a text produced after Christian traditions had already been circulating, growing, and splitting into different directions. On this view, Thomas knows the canonical Gospels, especially Matthew and Luke, even if it does not quote them word for word. Some sayings seem to combine details found separately in those Gospels. Others appear to alter familiar teachings in ways that make them more mysterious, more inward, more focused on hidden recognition. The theology can also look developed. Thomas repeatedly speaks about finding the kingdom within and around you. It tells readers to know themselves. It presents salvation less as rescue from sin through Jesus' death and resurrection, and more as awakening, recognition, discovering what has been hidden. That does not prove it must be late. Deep spiritual language existed in the 1st century too. Judaism already contained powerful traditions about wisdom, divine light, hidden mysteries, angels, paradise, and the knowledge of God. Early Christianity was never one single idea moving in one straight line. But the particular way Thomas arranges these ideas has led many researchers to suspect a later setting, a world where communities had time to debate what Jesus really meant, a world where his sayings could be interpreted not simply as teachings about God's coming reign, but as clues to a secret reality already present inside the person who understands. So, which side is right? Maybe neither side gets the whole picture, because the Gospel of Thomas may not have been written all at once. Imagine a box of old family letters. The oldest letter is from a grandmother. Another was added by her son. A third contains notes written decades later by someone trying to explain what the earlier letters meant. Eventually, the whole collection is bound together. The book is new, but not everything inside it is new. Thomas may work like that. Some sayings could be very old. Perhaps they go back to early oral traditions about Jesus. Some may have developed alongside the traditions used by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Others may have been reworded, expanded, or placed next to new sayings by later editors. And the final collection, the Gospel of Thomas as we know it, may have reached its present shape only after all of that. This is why scholars have to ask two different questions. When was this Gospel compiled? And when did this particular saying begin to circulate? Those are not the same question. A late collection can preserve an early memory, An early-looking saying can survive in a book compiled much later. At the same time, a saying that sounds ancient may have been deliberately written to sound ancient. Ancient writers knew how authority worked. They knew that a brief, mysterious saying carried weight. The final text gives us no neat timeline. It does not say these 20 sayings were written in the year 60. These 30 were added in 110, and the final editor finished the rest in 150. Instead, it gives us 114 sayings arranged like a locked room with no map of how the furniture got inside. And the evidence refuses to give us a clean escape. An early date can explain Thomas's independent, stripped-down sayings. A later date can explain its possible use of other gospel traditions and its distinctive theological language. A layered composition can explain both, but it also creates a new difficulty. If Thomas grew over time, where exactly do we draw the lines? Which sayings belong to the earliest layer? Which ones were transformed? Which ones were added last? There is no consensus that resolves every part of that mystery. What scholars can say is more careful, and maybe more interesting. The Gospel of Thomas probably reflects traditions from more than one moment in early Christianity. Its final form may be later than some of the material it contains, and every attempt to date it forces us to confront a larger question. Was Thomas preserving words that existed before the familiar gospel stories? Or was it taking familiar words and leading them somewhere else entirely? Or was it taking familiar words and leading them somewhere else entirely? That question becomes impossible to avoid when Thomas is placed beside the 4 canonical Gospels. Open Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and then read Thomas. At first, the overlap is unmistakable. You hear phrases that sound familiar. A mustard seed, a lamp placed where people can see it, a person who seeks and eventually finds, a shepherd and a lost sheep, a merchant who discovers a pearl worth everything he owns. These are not vague similarities. In several cases, Thomas and the canonical Gospels seem to be preserving versions of the same remembered teaching. Take the mustard seed. In Thomas, the disciples ask Jesus what the kingdom of heaven is like. He answers that it is like a mustard seed, tiny when it falls into prepared soil, but growing into a large plant, a shelter for the birds of heaven. Matthew has a mustard seed. Mark has a mustard seed. Luke has a mustard seed. In all 3, something almost invisible becomes unexpectedly large, and birds find shelter in its branches. The basic image is shared: small beginning, enormous result. A kingdom that does not arrive looking powerful, but grows until it cannot be ignored. Then there is the lamp. Thomas says that nobody lights a lamp and hides it under a basket or puts it in a concealed place. The lamp is placed on a stand, so those who come in and go out can see its light. Again, that sounds familiar. Matthew says a lamp is not put under a basket, but on a stand where it gives light to the whole house. Mark asks whether a lamp is brought in to be put under a basket or a bed. Luke says nothing hidden will remain concealed. Same object. Same common sense point. You light a lamp to give light. But then comes the problem. What exactly does the lamp mean? In Matthew, the saying is placed inside the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus tells his followers that they are the light of the world. The lamp becomes a call to visible faithfulness. Let your light shine, so others may see your good works and give glory to God. In Mark and Luke, the lamp can also point toward revelation. Things hidden will be disclosed. The truth about Jesus and the truth carried by his message will not stay buried forever. But in Thomas the saying stands almost alone. No mountain. No crowd, no explanation, no instruction about good works. No unfolding story of Jesus revealing himself to the world. just the lamp, and that changes everything. A reader of Matthew may hear a public command: live openly, let your faith become visible. A reader of Thomas may hear something more like an inner riddle. If light has been given, why is it hidden? If knowledge has been uncovered, who is ready to see it? Same image, different universe of interpretation. The saying about seeking makes the contrast even sharper. Matthew has Jesus say, "Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened." Luke preserves a very similar version. In those Gospels, the saying appears in a larger teaching about prayer, trust, and the generosity of God. Thomas gives the idea a much stranger path. Let one who seeks not stop seeking until one finds. When one finds, one will be disturbed. When one is disturbed, one will marvel and will reign over all. That is not just seeking and finding. That is seeking, finding, being shaken, and then entering a new state of awareness. The discovery is not comforting at first. It disturbs you. Imagine expecting a door to open, and instead finding that the floor underneath you has disappeared. That is the Thomas version. Knowledge is not merely information. It is an upheaval. It breaks the way you understood yourself, the world, perhaps even God. Only after disturbance comes wonder, and that difference is one reason scholars argue so fiercely about the relationship between Thomas and the canonical Gospels. Did Thomas borrow these sayings from written copies of Matthew, Mark, and Luke? That is one possibility. By the 2nd century, Gospel traditions were circulating across a wide Christian world. A writer or editor could have known material from more than one Gospel, remembered it imperfectly, shortened it, rearranged it, and reshaped it for a community with its own beliefs. Some features of Thomas make this possibility plausible. Its sayings sometimes resemble material found in Matthew and Luke especially closely. In other places, Thomas seems to combine elements that appear separately in the canonical texts. That could suggest someone working with already existing written Gospels. But there is another possibility. Thomas, Matthew, Mark, and Luke may sometimes draw from shared oral traditions. Before the Gospels were books, Jesus' sayings were spoken, remembered, repeated, translated, adapted, and passed between communities. A teacher might preserve a parable in Galilee, another might carry it into Syria, a third might repeat it in Greek decades later. No one needed to own a written Gospel of Matthew for the mustard seed story to travel. Think of it like folk songs. Two villages may sing nearly the same song, with different lines, different endings, and different meanings attached to it. That does not automatically mean one village copied the other's songbook. Both may have inherited an older melody. This is why similarity does not prove direct dependence. And difference does not prove independence. Thomas could preserve an earlier form of a saying, or it could preserve a later abbreviation. Matthew could have expanded a brief oral saying into a narrative setting, or Thomas could have stripped a longer gospel passage down to its most mysterious core. The evidence allows more than one route. John adds another complication. Thomas has far fewer obvious verbal parallels with the Gospel of John than it does with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Yet both texts can sound interested in themes like light, life, revelation, and knowing. That does not mean Thomas copied John, or John copied Thomas. Those themes were already moving through Jewish wisdom traditions and early Christian thought. Shared language can emerge from a shared world, but altered wording still matters, because a few changed words can redirect an entire teaching. In the canonical Gospels, the kingdom is often announced through stories of Jesus' ministry, his healings, his conflicts, his journey toward Jerusalem, his death, and the claim of resurrection. The sayings live inside a larger drama. They are connected to a person moving through time. Thomas removes much of that frame. No Bethlehem, no Nazareth, no storm on the sea, no feeding of 5,000, no trial before Pilate, no empty tomb. Instead, a saying appears like an object dug out of the ground. And you have to decide what it was for. Was Thomas preserving fragments from before the stories were built around them? Or was it taking familiar gospel words, removing them from their old setting, and turning them into keys for a radically different beginning? That question leads to the strangest feature of all. The Gospel of Thomas does not tell you what Jesus did. It tells you what Jesus said. There is no angel appearing to Mary, no manger, no Bethlehem, no genealogy reaching back to Abraham or all the way back to Adam. Jesus does not walk beside the Sea of Galilee calling fishermen. He does not heal lepers, cast out demons, calm storms, feed crowds, enter Jerusalem on a donkey, stand before Pilate, die on a cross, or rise from a tomb. None of it is there. Thomas begins with a title, "These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, and which Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down." Then, almost immediately, it makes a promise that sounds both familiar and deeply unsettling. Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. Not whoever witnesses the resurrection. Not whoever believes that Jesus died for sins. Not whoever joins the right community, performs the right ritual, or waits for the final judgment. Whoever finds the interpretation. That single sentence tells you what kind of gospel this is. In the canonical Gospels, Jesus' words matter because they belong to his life, his actions, his death, and for Christians, his resurrection. The story moves forward. Jesus arrives, he teaches. He confronts powers, he suffers, he dies. Then comes the claim that death itself has been defeated. Thomas gives you almost none of that movement. It is like being handed a box full of keys with no map of the building they were meant to unlock. The reader is not mainly invited to watch salvation happen. The reader is invited to understand, to search beneath the surface of a saying, to recognize what was hidden in plain sight, to discover something about the kingdom, the world, and perhaps the reader's own origin. That does not necessarily mean Thomas denies Jesus' death or resurrection. Silence is not the same thing as rejection. The people who collected these sayings may have known stories about the crucifixion perfectly well. They may have heard them read in worship. They may have accepted them. Thomas simply does not make those events the centre of this particular book. And that distinction matters. A collection of sayings does not have to contain everything a community believed. Nobody would conclude that the book of Proverbs denies the Exodus because it does not retell it. A hymn collection may never mention a king's childhood, even if every singer knows the king's story. Some scholars therefore see Thomas as a specialized anthology. A book for meditation, a gathering of difficult teachings for people who already knew the wider Christian story. Under that reading, its silence about the cross is not a rebellion against the cross. It is a choice of genre, but other scholars see something more dramatic. They argue that Thomas reflects a different centre of gravity. In this reading, the deepest human problem is not primarily guilt requiring forgiveness through a saving event in history. It is ignorance, forgetfulness, blindness to a divine reality that is already present, already near, but unseen. And if the problem is ignorance, then salvation looks different. It becomes recognition. This is the shift that makes Thomas feel so alien, even when its individual sayings sound familiar. In many early Christian writings, salvation is tied to things God has done. God sends Jesus. Jesus announces the kingdom. Jesus dies. Jesus rises. The disciples encounter the risen Christ. A future renewal is promised. History has a shape. There is a before and an after. Something happened that changed the fate of the world. Thomas often sounds as if the decisive discovery must happen inside the person hearing the saying. The kingdom is not simply coming later. It is not merely waiting beyond death. It is something that must be recognized now. The truth is not just announced from the outside. It has to be uncovered. That is why interpretation is so important. A Thomas saying is rarely content to be understood once. It seems designed to keep opening. A simple image becomes a question. A question becomes a challenge, and the challenge turns back toward the person reading. What do you see? What have you failed to see? What does it mean if the kingdom is near, but you remain unable to recognize it? The opening promise says that whoever finds the interpretation will not taste death. That phrase has echoes in the Gospel of John, where Jesus speaks of those who keep his word never seeing death. But Thomas frames the issue differently. It places interpretation at the threshold. Not just hearing, not just repeating, finding. The Greek word behind interpretation can carry the sense of explanation or meaning. But Thomas makes meaning sound like a treasure buried beneath the words. The saying is not merely a command to obey, it is a riddle to enter. And the reward is enormous, freedom from death. What could that mean? Perhaps it means literal immortality, a promise that the one who understands will pass beyond death's power. Perhaps it means escape from spiritual death, from the blindness and division that make a person dead even while alive. Perhaps it points toward a future resurrection understood in a different language. The text does not pause to define its terms. That ambiguity is part of its force. Thomas does not hand you a systematic theology. It hands you a door with no handle. For some readers, that is precisely the attraction. The canonical Gospels tell a powerful public story. A teacher moves through villages. Crowds gather. Authorities react. History closes in. Then the execution and the empty tomb transform everything. Thomas strips away the crowds, the geography, the chronology, and the drama. Jesus becomes almost entirely a voice speaking in short bursts. A voice that says the kingdom is here and not here. That what is hidden will be revealed. That the seeker must continue, that the one who knows oneself will be known, that what you are looking for may be closer than your own breath. But something is gained by that stripping away, and something is lost. What is gained is intensity. Without a narrative telling you what to think, each saying becomes harder to domesticate. You cannot easily say, that was for the Pharisees, or that happened on the road to Jerusalem. The words are suspended in front of you. They demand a response now. But what is lost is the story of a suffering person. In Thomas, Jesus rarely weeps, hungers, touches the sick, argues with opponents, fears death or forgives those who kill him. The Jesus of Thomas can feel less like a figure walking through first-century Roman Judea and more like a heavenly teacher speaking from outside ordinary time. For some Christians, that is a profound loss. Without the cross and resurrection, the gospel's central announcement has been removed. Salvation becomes private insight. The poor, the suffering, the oppressed, and the dying may be left with riddles when they need a God who acts in history. But defenders of Thomas might answer that insight is not private at all. If human beings are trapped by false ways of seeing, then awakening could change everything. How you treat others, what you fear, what you desire. What kind of world you are willing to build. The debate has never really ended. Is Thomas offering a different gospel of salvation? Or is it preserving one narrow, demanding dimension of early Christian faith? The conviction that Jesus' words are not exhausted by hearing them once. Either way, Thomas asks a dangerous question. What if salvation is not only something that happened to Jesus, or something promised after death? What if it begins when a person finally understands what they have been hearing all along? And that brings us to the kingdom. In the canonical Gospels, the kingdom of God is one of Jesus' central themes. But it can be difficult to pin down. Sometimes it sounds future. God is about to act. The world will be judged. The powerful will be brought down. The poor will be lifted up. Evil will be defeated. The dead will rise. History is moving toward a final intervention. Sometimes it sounds present. The kingdom is near. It is among you. It is breaking in through healings, meals, forgiveness, and the gathering of a new community. Thomas takes that second possibility and pushes it to an extreme. The disciples ask Jesus, "When will the kingdom come?" It is exactly the question you would expect. When will it happen? What signs should we watch for? Will there be a great upheaval in the sky? Armies? Angels, a final battle between God and the powers of the world? Jesus answers it will not come by waiting for it. It will not be a matter of saying, "Look here," or "Look there," rather. The Father's kingdom is spread out upon the earth, and people do not see it. That is saying 130, and it changes the entire frame. The kingdom is not absent. It is not delayed. It is not hidden somewhere beyond the clouds, waiting for the calendar of heaven to reach its final page. It is spread out upon the earth, already here. The problem is not that people are waiting too early. The problem is that they are looking without seeing. Think about how strange that would have sounded in a world full of apocalyptic expectation. First-century Jews lived under Roman rule. Their land was occupied. Taxes were heavy. Soldiers were everywhere. Ancient promises spoke of God restoring Israel, judging corrupt rulers, and setting the world right. Waiting for the kingdom was not just a theological hobby. It was a hope that history could be changed. Thomas does not exactly deny that hope. It never lays out a detailed alternative timeline. But it repeatedly refuses to let the kingdom become only a future event. The disciples want a date. Thomas gives them a vision problem. They want to know when the kingdom will arrive. Thomas asks why they have not recognized where they already are. Another saying makes the point even more sharply. Jesus says, "The kingdom is inside you, and it is outside you." That is saying 3. In some translations it reads, "The kingdom is within you and outside you." The exact wording matters because within can sound purely private, almost psychological. As if Thomas is saying that all spiritual truth is buried in your feelings, waiting to be uncovered through enough quiet reflection. But that is probably too simple. The saying does not say the kingdom is only inside you. It is inside and outside. Within the seeker, yes, but also beyond the seeker, in the world, in reality itself, in other people, in what the eyes pass over every day without understanding. Thomas is not giving us a modern slogan about believing in yourself. It is making a much more unsettling claim. If the kingdom is inside and outside, then there is no way you can go to escape the question. You cannot travel far enough to find it, because it is already near. You cannot retreat deeply enough into yourself to possess it, because it is not your private property. You cannot point to one holy place, one institution, one teacher, one ritual, and say, "It is only there." The kingdom is everywhere. And somehow it remains unseen. That is why Thomas keeps returning to words like seek, find, know, reveal, and see. These are not decorative words. They are the engine of the text. Let one who seeks not stop seeking until one finds, Jesus says in saying 2. When one finds, one will be disturbed. When one is disturbed, one will marvel, and one will reign over all. Seeking leads to finding. Finding does not lead immediately to comfort, it leads to disturbance. Because if the kingdom is already spread out upon the earth, then the world you thought you understood is not the real world, or at least not the whole of it. Your ordinary categories begin to fail. Near and far, inner and outer, present and future, sacred and ordinary. These divisions become less stable. And Thomas seems to think religious people may be especially vulnerable to missing what is right in front of them. In saying 39, Jesus criticizes the Pharisees and scribes. He says they have taken the keys of knowledge and hidden them. They did not enter, and they prevented others who wished to enter. This is harsh language, and it should be handled carefully. It reflects the fierce arguments of early Christian communities, not a reliable portrait of every Pharisee or Jewish teacher. The Pharisees were not cartoon villains. They were diverse religious thinkers, deeply concerned with scripture, ethics, and the life of Israel. But within Thomas, the warning is clear. Knowledge can become a gate. Religion can become a locked door. The people who claim to guard the way may not recognize what they are guarding. They may memorize sacred words, debate rules, preserve traditions, and still fail to enter. Worse, they may teach everyone else to look in the wrong direction. Look to the future only. Look to the authorities only. Look to the approved answers only, and all the while the kingdom is spread out upon the earth. This does not mean Thomas rejects community or teaching. The text itself is a book of teachings. It expects readers to wrestle with sayings passed down through a tradition. But it distrusts second-hand certainty. Nobody can do the seeing for you. You can inherit the words. You can repeat the words. You can build institutions around the words. But if you do not find their meaning, Thomas suggests, you may still be standing outside the door. So what kind of kingdom is this? Is it inward? In one sense, yes. Thomas repeatedly turns the reader towards self-knowledge. The kingdom has something to do with a transformation of perception, with recognizing a truth that has been obscured by ignorance. Is it cosmic? Also, yes. The kingdom is not confined to the human mind. It is outside you. It is spread upon the earth. Thomas speaks as if reality itself is charged with a hidden origin, a light behind appearances, a divine fullness that the visible world somehow conceals. Is it communal? That may be the hardest question. Thomas can sound intensely individual. The seeker seeks. The finder finds. The person who understands escapes death. But the sayings were preserved by a community. They were read, copied, debated, and handed from one person to another. And a kingdom spread across the earth cannot be reduced to one person's inner experience. Maybe Thomas is not offering a choice between inner awakening and transformed reality. Maybe it is saying they belong together. To see the kingdom is to see differently. And to see differently is to discover that the world, other people, and even your own life are not what you thought they were. But Thomas will not let that discovery become easy. The kingdom is here. The kingdom is hidden. The seeker must find. And the first thing the seeker may discover is how long they have been looking directly at it without seeing anything at all. And that brings us back to the most unsettling sequence in the entire Gospel of Thomas. Let one who seeks not stop seeking until one finds. When one finds, one will be disturbed. When one is disturbed, one will marvel, and one will reign over all. It is only a few lines. But it gives us a complete spiritual journey. Seek, find, be disturbed, marvel, reign. That is not the sequence most religious texts promise. Usually seeking leads to finding, and finding leads to peace. You search for God, truth, forgiveness, salvation, wisdom, and eventually the anxiety ends. The lost are found. The confused receive answers. The wounded are comforted. Thomas takes a different route. Finding does not settle the seeker. Finding breaks something open. The word translated disturbed can also be rendered troubled, shaken, alarmed, even thrown into confusion. The precise shade depends on the translation, and the surviving manuscripts are not identical in every detail. But the direction is unmistakable. The discovery is not immediately reassuring. It is disruptive. Why? Because Thomas is not talking about finding a piece of information. It is not like discovering the answer to a puzzle, writing it down and moving on. The seeker finds something that changes the seeker. Maybe they find that the kingdom is already here, spread across the earth, while they have spent their life looking somewhere else. Maybe they find that the self they thought they knew is not their deepest self. Maybe they find that the divisions organizing ordinary life, inside and outside, sacred and ordinary, human and divine, life and death, are not as solid as they appeared. And that is disturbing because most of us depend on those divisions. They tell us who we are. They tell us where safety is. They tell us what counts as real. Thomas seems to suggest that before a person can see clearly, they may have to lose confidence in the world as they previously understood it. That idea was not unique to Thomas. Ancient philosophy often treated genuine learning as a shock to the system. In Plato's famous image of the cave, prisoners live their entire lives watching shadows on a wall. They mistake those shadows for reality. Then one prisoner is dragged outside into the light. At first the light hurts. He is confused. He wants to return to the familiar darkness. Truth is not comfortable because the old illusion was comfortable. In Greek philosophy there was even a word for the moment when thought reaches its limit and certainty collapses. Aporia, a state of puzzlement. You thought you knew. Then a question reveals that you do not. Socrates made a career out of producing that feeling in people. He would ask simple questions about courage, justice, wisdom, virtue. His conversation partners would begin confident. By the end, they often discovered that the words they used most easily were the words they understood least. That is disturbance, not ignorance by itself, the painful recognition of ignorance. Ancient religious traditions knew this pattern too. Prophets encounter the holy and become afraid. Visionaries see what others do not see and find themselves overwhelmed. Mystery cults promised revelation, but revelation was often imagined as an encounter with death, darkness, transformation, and rebirth. You do not pass into a new world while remaining entirely unchanged by the old one. Thomas belongs somewhere in that wider ancient atmosphere. Not as a simple copy of Greek philosophy or mystery religion, but as a text that shares a dangerous conviction. Real knowledge is not merely added to the mind, it rearranges the person. But then comes the next step. When one is disturbed, one will marvel. That is strange too. Disturbance becomes wonder. The Greek philosophical tradition used a word for wonder, thaumazein, as the beginning of philosophy. You look at the world and suddenly realize it is stranger than you thought. The ordinary becomes mysterious. The familiar becomes impossible to take for granted. Thomas may be describing something similar. The seeker finds. The finding destroys an old certainty. Then, instead of falling into despair, the seeker begins to marvel. The world has not become smaller, it has become deeper. The kingdom spread out upon the earth is no longer just a phrase. It becomes a possibility. Reality may be filled with a meaning that was there all along, hidden, not because it was far away, but because the seeker lacked the eyes to see it. And then comes the final line. One will reign over all. This is where Thomas becomes especially difficult. What does it mean to reign? Surely not political rule. Thomas gives no program for taking kingdoms, commanding armies, or placing the enlightened above everyone else. In fact, Other sayings warn against conventional power, wealth, and status. Some translations say the seeker will rule over the all, others preserve a related ending in which, after reigning, the person comes to rest. That variation matters. It suggests that reigning may not mean domination at all. It may mean freedom, freedom from being ruled by ignorance, freedom from fear of death, freedom from the false identities handed to us by the world. If you know where you come from, Thomas suggests, then the world's usual claims over you begin to weaken. The seeker is no longer entirely controlled by appearances, by social rank, by hunger for approval, by the endless need to protect a fragile self. But that brings us to the question Thomas keeps opening, without fully answering. What exactly has the seeker found? A hidden kingdom? A divine light? The true self? A forgotten human origin? The sayings do not give us a neat doctrinal chart. There is no single explanation, followed by a list of required beliefs. Thomas makes the reader travel through the sequence instead. Seek without stopping. Find what unsettles you. Stay inside the disturbance long enough for it to become wonder. And then ask whether the person you have always called yourself was ever the whole story. Because in Thomas, the deepest mystery may not be where humanity is going. It may be what humanity was before it forgot what it was. And that question leads directly into one of Thomas's strangest ideas. The idea that the human being we see may not be the first version of the human being. In saying 84, Jesus says, "When you see your likeness, you rejoice. But when you see your images that came into being before you, and that neither die nor become manifest, how much you will have to bear." It is a short saying, but it opens an enormous door. First, Thomas distinguishes between your likeness and your images. Your likeness is presumably what you recognize. Your face, your body, the familiar self looking back from a reflection, a pool of water, another person's eyes. You see it and you rejoice, because it confirms the identity you already know. That is me. I am here. I have a shape, a name, a history. But then Thomas introduces something else. Images that existed before you. Images that do not die. Images that do not become manifest. And suddenly, ordinary human identity is no longer the starting point. It is almost the surface of something much older and much less visible. What are these images? Thomas does not stop to explain. That is the frustrating part, and perhaps the point. The Gospel gives sayings, not definitions. It drops a phrase into your mind and leaves it there like a stone falling into deep water. You can see the ripples. You cannot immediately see the bottom. Still, the language did not appear out of nowhere. Ancient Jewish scripture had already described humanity as made in the image of God. In Genesis, God creates humankind in our image according to our likeness. That idea became one of the foundational claims of Jewish and Christian thought. Human beings are creatures of earth, made from dust in one Genesis account. Fragile, mortal, hungry, vulnerable, but they also somehow bear the image of the divine. That creates a tension running through the entire biblical tradition. What are we exactly? Are we dust animated by breath? Are we material beings carrying a divine stamp? Are we fallen images, damaged but not erased? Or are we copies of a reality that exists beyond the visible world? By the 1st century, Jewish and Christian thinkers were already wrestling with questions like these. Some interpreted the image of God as humanity's reason, moral capacity, or authority over creation. Others connected it to an ideal human reality existing with God before earthly life. The Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, writing around the time of Jesus and the earliest Christian movement, distinguished between the heavenly human of Genesis and the earthly human formed from dust. His interpretation was complex, and it was not the only one, but it shows that the idea of a primordial, invisible humanity was already circulating in the ancient world. Early Christians developed related language around Christ. In Paul's letters, Christ can be called the image of God. Paul also contrasts Adam, the earthly man, with a heavenly man. Later, Christian theologians would build entire systems around that contrast. Humanity, in this view, does not simply begin in a garden with soil and breath. Humanity has a deeper pattern, a divine prototype, an origin above the origin, and that may be the world Thomas is touching. But we have to be careful. The Gospel of Thomas never gives us a full myth in which souls fall from heaven, become trapped in bodies, and must escape back to a lost spiritual realm. Later esoteric readers often find that story in Thomas. It is easy to see why. The text talks about hidden things, light, images and origins that precede ordinary life. But Thomas itself is more restrained. It does not provide a map of the heavens. It does not name a primordial cosmic human. It does not plainly say that the body is a prison. Those are interpretations brought to the text, sometimes from later Gnostic writings, sometimes from modern spiritual traditions, sometimes from the reader's own longing for a forgotten beginning. What Thomas actually gives us is more haunting than a clear system. It gives us the possibility that the self you can see is not the self that matters most, and it connects that possibility to light. In saying 50, the disciples are told that if people ask where they came from, they should answer, "We came from the light, the place where the light came into being by itself." That is an extraordinary claim. Not, "We came from a tribe." Not, "We came from Adam." Not, "We came from the earth." We came from the light. The saying continues by identifying this light as something that revealed itself in their image. The language is difficult, and translations vary, but the central pattern is clear. Light, origin, and image belong together. There is a visible human being, there is an invisible image, and behind both is light. If you're drawn to mysteries like this, you can get our channel's book about the 12 unexplained mysteries through the website. The link is in the description now. None of this means Thomas rejects the human story told by ordinary history. The text is not trying to explain migration, ancestry, evolution, or the first settlement of the earth. It is asking a different kind of origin question, not where did your body come from? Where did your deepest identity come from? That shift changes everything. Most origin stories begin behind us, in an ancestral past. A first couple, a lost garden, a sacred act of creation. Thomas turns the question inward and upward at the same time. Your origin may not only be an event that happened long ago, it may be a reality hidden within you now, and if that is true, then seeing your ordinary likeness is easy. Seeing the image that existed before you is the real disturbance, because it means humanity may not have begun with what is visible. It may have begun with light, but if the deepest human origin is hidden behind the visible self, then Thomas asks an even stranger question. What happened to that original unity? Why do human beings experience themselves as divided? Divided between what they show and what they feel, between body and mind, desire and conscience, the person they are in public and the person they become alone, between the life they are living and the life they suspect they were meant to live. The Gospel of Thomas does not use modern psychological language. It does not talk about trauma, alienation, or fractured identity. But it keeps returning to a single impossible command: make the two one. In saying 22, Jesus sees infants being nursed. The disciples ask whether entering the kingdom means becoming like children. His answer is not simple. It becomes one of the densest passages in the whole Gospel. When you make the two one, and when you make the inner like the outer, and the outer like the inner, and the upper like the lower, and when you make male and female into a single one, then you will enter the kingdom. That is not ordinary moral advice. It sounds like a riddle from before the world was split into categories. Inner and outer, above and below, male and female, two becoming one. And notice what Thomas is doing. It is not merely telling people to choose one side over another. It does not say the inner is good and the outer is bad. It does not say heaven matters while earth does not. It does not say male must overcome female, or female must overcome male. Instead, it speaks of correspondence, reconciliation, a condition in which the divisions that structure ordinary experience no longer have the final word. The inner becomes like the outer becomes like the inner. What you are within and what you appear to be are no longer enemies. For some readers, that is the heart of Thomas's spirituality. The kingdom is not reached by escaping to another location. It is recognized when the divided self becomes whole. Think about how radical that would have sounded in the ancient world. Society was built on boundaries, Jew and Gentile, clean and unclean, slave and free, male and female, earth below, heaven above, the visible world, the invisible God. Thomas does not necessarily erase every practical distinction. The text never lays out a political program or a social constitution, but its language presses against the idea that these opposites define the deepest truth about a person. At the deepest level, it suggests the human being is not meant to remain divided, and that may explain the strange language about becoming like children. A child in this saying may not mean innocent in the sentimental sense. It may point to a condition before social status hardens around you. Before you become a role, before you are trained to see yourself as one half of a divided world, before division. That phrase may be the key, because Jewish scripture begins with an image that Thomas's first readers would have known well. In Genesis, humanity is created male and female in the image of God. Then, in the second creation account, the human is formed from the earth, and woman is described as being made from the side of the first human. These passages generated endless interpretation in the ancient world. Was the first human originally complete, containing both male and female? Was the separation of the sexes part of creation's goodness? Or did it symbolize a deeper human fragmentation, a movement from original unity into a world of difference, desire, labor, and death? Thomas does not answer those questions directly, but saying 22 seems to echo their atmosphere. Its goal is not simply to return people to childhood. It is to recover something prior to the split, not necessarily prior to biological sex, not necessarily a denial of embodied life, but prior to the condition in which human identity is experienced as separation. This is where interpretations begin to diverge. Some scholars read the saying socially. In that reading, male and female becoming one challenges hierarchies. In the kingdom, the status attached to being male or female loses its power. The distinction no longer determines who is greater, who teaches, who rules, who belongs. Other interpreters see a spiritual meaning. Male and female can symbolize active and receptive, rational and emotional, outward and inward, strength and vulnerability. To make them one is to integrate the conflicting forces within the self. Still others see ritual language. Ancient religious communities often used symbolic reversals, new names, new clothing, baptismal imagery, and ideas of becoming a new person. In that context, making two one may describe transformation within a community of initiation. And then there is the cosmological reading. The ancient Mediterranean world was full of traditions that imagined reality, as a descent from unity into multiplicity. Plato, centuries before Christianity, had explored the tension between the changing world of appearances and a higher reality of enduring forms. In Plato's Symposium, Aristophanes tells a myth of primeval human beings who were once whole and later divided, spending their lives longing for reunion. That myth is not the Gospel of Thomas. Thomas never quotes it. It does not tell us that human beings were literally split in half by the gods. But it shows that the idea of lost human wholeness was already in the air. Later, Jewish mystics, Christian contemplatives, and esoteric teachers would return to similar language. The soul is scattered, the heart is divided, the image is obscured. Salvation is reunion. Not becoming someone else, but becoming what you were always meant to be. Thomas may stand somewhere near the beginning of that long tradition, but its words remain difficult, especially the phrase about male and female. Modern readers sometimes want a quick answer. Is the saying rejecting gender? Is it calling for equality? Is it describing celibacy? Is it referring to mystical androgyny? Is it preserving an ancient ritual formula? The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty. The Coptic text from Nag Hammadi is itself a translation from Greek, and some phrases are awkward enough that scholars debate their precise force. More importantly, Thomas gives us no commentary, no story explaining the saying. No apostle asking Jesus what he means. No doctrinal conclusion at the end. Just the riddle, make the two one, and Thomas repeats the formula elsewhere. In saying 106, Jesus tells the disciples, when you make the two one, you will become children of humanity. Again, unity is not presented as a vague feeling of peace. It is a transformation. Something changes in what it means to be human, that connects directly to the images and light we have already seen. If humanity has an origin in light, if there is an image that existed before the visible self, then division may be the condition of forgetting that origin. You see yourself as isolated. You see the world as fragmented. You see the divine as distant, above, outside, somewhere beyond reach. But the kingdom in Thomas is already here and already spread out across the earth. So perhaps unity is not manufactured from nothing. Perhaps it is uncovered. The two are made one because at the deepest level they were never meant to be finally separate. And that brings Thomas back toward the oldest human memory of all. A beginning, a garden, a human being before exile, before shame, before division became the normal shape of life. A beginning, a garden, a human being before exile, before shame, before division became the normal shape of life. And this is where the Gospel of Thomas brings Adam back into the story. Not with a long retelling of Genesis. Thomas does not describe God forming Adam from dust. It does not describe the serpent, the forbidden tree, Eve's creation, or the expulsion from Eden. There is no complete alternate creation story hidden between its sayings. Instead, there are fragments, brief references, strange comments, a few lines that assume Adam and paradise are already known, then turn them in an unexpected direction. The most important appears in saying 85. Jesus says, Adam came into being from a great power and a great wealth, but he did not become worthy of you. For had he been worthy, he would not have tasted death. It is one of the most unsettling statements in Thomas. Adam came from great power, great wealth. That language does not sound like ordinary material wealth. Adam in Genesis is not introduced as a king with treasure chests or armies. He is a creature of the earth, placed in a garden, given breath by God, surrounded by abundance. So what does Thomas mean by great power and great wealth? Many readers hear an echo of Adam's original dignity. He came from God. He was made in the divine image. He was placed in paradise. He began, in some sense, with access to life, knowledge, abundance, and communion with the source of all things. But then Thomas adds the reversal. He did not become worthy of you. Not worthy of whom? The saying seems to address Jesus' followers, perhaps those who have received the hidden teaching of the kingdom. That is astonishing, Adam. The first human, the ancestor of humanity, came from immense greatness. Yet the people listening to these sayings are told that they may possess something Adam failed to grasp. And the proof is death. Had Adam been worthy, Thomas says, he would not have tasted death. Now compare that with Genesis. In Genesis, Adam's death is tied to disobedience. He is commanded not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He eats. The consequence is exile from the garden, a life of labour and pain, and finally, a return to dust. Later Jewish and Christian interpretation expanded that story in different directions. Some saw Adam's failure primarily as disobedience. Others saw it as pride, desire, deception, or the misuse of freedom. Much later Christian theology, especially in the West, often connected Adam's fall to the universal human condition, sin, mortality, and the need for redemption. But Thomas does something different. It does not mention disobedience. It does not mention guilt inherited by later generations. It does not say Adam broke a command and brought condemnation on the human race. Instead, the problem seems closer to unworthiness. Failure to recognize. Failure to receive or become what was possible. That fits the pattern we have been seeing all along. In Thomas, the kingdom is present but unnoticed. Light exists, but people fail to see it. The image is there, but it is hidden behind appearances. The human problem is not described mainly as breaking a rule. It is described as blindness, ignorance, separation. A person can be surrounded by the kingdom and still miss it. Adam can come from great power and great wealth and still taste death. That is a very different way of reading the lost beginning. And Thomas gives us another clue in saying 19. There, Jesus speaks of the one who existed before coming into being. Then he mentions 5 trees in paradise that do not change with the seasons. Their leaves do not fall. Whoever knows them, he says, will not taste death. Again, paradise appears, but not as a location on a map, not as a garden you can travel back to by walking east. The 5 trees are mysterious. Scholars have proposed many explanations. They may symbolize spiritual realities, divine attributes, sacred texts, ritual stages, or something else entirely. The text does not explain them, and certainty is impossible. But their unchanging nature matters. In the ordinary world, trees change. Leaves grow, wither, and fall, seasons turn, bodies age. Everything visible moves toward decay. The trees in paradise do not. They belong to a reality untouched by the normal rhythm of death, and whoever knows them will not taste death. Notice that word again, knows. Not merely obeys, not merely believes the correct statement. Knows for Thomas. Knowledge is not just collecting information. It is recognition. It is awakening to what is hidden in plain sight. It is seeing the source beneath the surface of things. So is paradise in Thomas, a lost place. Maybe. The language clearly draws on the old biblical memory of Eden. The garden before death became humanity's condition. But Thomas also makes paradise feel present. The kingdom is already spread across the earth. The living Jesus tells his followers that what they seek is within them and outside them. The reality of life is not simply locked behind the gate of a vanished garden. It can be recognized now. That does not mean Thomas denies the pain of the world. Death is real in these sayings. Confusion is real. Human beings remain divided, distracted, and asleep. But the text keeps suggesting that exile is more than geography. You do not only leave paradise by being driven from a garden. You leave it when you forget where you came from, when you no longer recognize the light within you, when the inner and outer become enemies, when the world appears fragmented, and you assume fragmentation is the final truth. In that sense, Adam is not just a figure from the distant past. He is every human being, born from great power and great wealth, yet living as though cut off from both. And that raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if the lost beginning is not merely behind us? What if it is buried beneath the way we see ourselves now? That possibility leads directly to the question that has followed the Gospel of Thomas ever since it was pulled from the Egyptian sand. Is this a Gnostic gospel at first? The answer can seem obvious. Thomas speaks about hidden things. It tells readers to seek until they find. It speaks of light within human beings. It describes people as living in a world they do not understand, asleep to their own origin, unable to see the kingdom spread out before them. That sounds Gnostic, and for a long time many scholars, church historians and popular writers treated the question as settled. Thomas was found at Nag Hammadi alongside texts now commonly associated with Gnostic Christianity. It contained secret sayings attributed to Jesus. It seemed to offer salvation through knowledge, not through the cross, the resurrection, or membership in the visible church. Case closed, except it wasn't, because Gnostic is one of those labels that can be useful right up until it starts hiding more than it reveals. The word comes from the Greek gnosis, meaning knowledge, but not knowledge in the ordinary sense, not knowing the distance between two cities, or memorizing a list of commandments. Gnosis meant a deeper kind of recognition, knowledge of where the soul came from, knowledge of the divine reality hidden behind the visible world, knowledge that wakes a person up. Many ancient groups that modern scholars call Gnostic believed the material universe was fundamentally flawed, even hostile. They told vast cosmic stories about the origin of the world. Above everything was an ultimate, unknowable divine source. From that source came a series of lesser divine beings, sometimes called aeons. Then, through catastrophe, error, or rebellion, a lower creator came into being. This lower creator, often called the demiurge, made the material world. In some of these myths, he is the God described in Genesis. He believes he is the highest God because he does not know the greater divine reality beyond him. Human beings contain sparks of the true light, trapped inside bodies, and a world they were never meant to inhabit. Salvation comes when the spark remembers its origin and finds a way home. Now, read certain sayings in Thomas with that story in mind, and the connections are easy to see. Thomas values hidden knowledge. It repeatedly contrasts seeing with blindness, life with death, awakening with ignorance. Saying 3 tells the disciples that when they know themselves, they will be known, and they will understand that they are children of the living Father. But if they do not know themselves, they live in poverty, and they are poverty. That is not ordinary religious language. It makes self-knowledge sound like rescue. Then there is the language of light. In saying 24, Jesus says there is light within a person of light, and that light illumines the whole world. In saying 50, the disciples are told that if people ask where they came from, they should say they came from the light, from the place where light came into being by itself. And there is alienation from the world. Thomas calls the disciples strangers. It tells them to become passers-by. It warns them not to become attached to what surrounds them. It speaks as if ordinary life can keep human beings distracted from their true source. Those are real overlaps with Gnostic thought. They should not be ignored. But here is where it gets complicated. The Gospel of Thomas never tells the great Gnostic myth. There is no elaborate chain of divine beings, no heavenly disaster. no demiurge who creates the world in ignorance, no evil ruler imprisoning souls in matter, no detailed account of a divine spark falling from a higher realm into human bodies. And perhaps most importantly, Thomas does not clearly say that matter itself is evil. The world is dangerous in Thomas. It can deceive. People can become drunk on it, asleep within it, enslaved by their own blindness. But that is not the same thing as saying creation is a cosmic prison built by an inferior god. In fact, Thomas contains sayings that make the relationship more ambiguous. The kingdom is said to be spread out upon the earth. The Father's kingdom is described as being within and outside. The problem is not simply that the world is bad. The problem is that people do not see what is already present. That is a very different kind of spiritual map. Think of the contrast between Thomas and some of the other texts found at Nag Hammadi. The Apocryphon of John gives readers a full cosmic drama, the highest divine realm, the fall of Sophia, the arrogant creator, the making of Adam, the rulers who govern the material universe, and the hidden spirit placed within humanity. It is mythological, complicated, and unmistakably concerned with explaining why the world is broken. Thomas gives you almost none of that. It gives you sayings. It gives you riddles. It gives you Jesus telling people to split wood and find him there, lift a stone and discover him there. It gives you a kingdom already present, a light already shining, an origin already somehow connected to the person who learns to see. So perhaps Thomas is Gnostic in mood without being Gnostic in system. Or perhaps it preserves ideas that later Gnostic movements would develop more fully. Or perhaps it belongs to a broader world of ancient Jewish and Christian mysticism, where hidden wisdom, heavenly light, transformed identity, and the search for the true self were not limited to one single movement. This is why many scholars today are more careful. Instead of treating the Gnostics as one unified church with one theology, they distinguish between particular Gnostic groups, particular mythological systems, and a much wider range of esoteric currents moving through the ancient Mediterranean world. Some Christians emphasized apostolic authority and public teaching. Others emphasized visions. Others emphasized ritual. Others sought hidden interpretations of Scripture. Others believed Jesus had delivered secret wisdom to a chosen few. These groups borrowed ideas, argued with each other, changed over time, and did not always fit the categories later historians gave them. And Thomas may be sitting near the edge of several worlds at once. It can sound close to the Gospel of John in its language of light and revelation. It can echo Jewish wisdom traditions in its riddles and calls to seek. It can resemble later Gnostic texts in its focus on awakening from ignorance. Yet it remains strangely resistant to being placed entirely inside any one box. That matters because labels create expectations. Call Thomas Gnostic, and people may imagine a book that rejects the God of Israel, despises the body, and teaches escape from an evil universe. But Thomas itself is more elusive than that. It certainly asks readers to loosen their grip on the world. It certainly believes human beings are lost in a profound way. It certainly presents recognition, knowledge, and inner transformation as central to life. But it does not hand us a simple map of enemies, heavens, and cosmic escape routes. Instead, it leaves us with a harder question. What if the prison is not matter itself? What if the prison is the failure to recognize the light that is already here? But that question becomes even harder when Thomas starts talking about the world itself, because some of its sayings sound almost brutal. In saying 56, Jesus says, "Whoever has come to understand the world has found a corpse, and whoever has found a corpse, of that person the world is not worthy." A corpse. Not a garden, not a sacred creation, not a place of beauty damaged by human sin. A corpse. And then in another saying with similar language, Jesus says, Whoever has come to know the world has found the body, and whoever has found the body, of that person the world is not worthy. These are among the darkest lines in the entire collection. They seem to suggest that the world, and perhaps the body too, are not sources of life at all. They are dead things, things a person must see through before they can become truly alive. Read that way, Thomas can sound like a gospel of escape. The visible world is a trap, the body is a prison. Ordinary human life is a kind of sleepwalking inside a decaying system. Find the hidden knowledge, remember where you came from, and detach yourself before the corpse pulls you down with it. That interpretation has been enormously influential, and it is not invented out of nowhere. Thomas tells its readers to become passers-by. It praises those who seek separation from the world. In saying 27, Jesus says, "If you do not fast from the world, you will not find the kingdom." In saying 110, he says that whoever has found the world and become wealthy should renounce the world. That is not a message of comfortable religious belonging. It is a demand. Do not let possessions own you. Do not let routine numb you. Do not let the world convince you that survival, status, pleasure and security are the whole meaning of existence. But then Thomas does something frustrating. Just when it seems ready to condemn the body completely, it gives us sayings that make that conclusion much less certain. In saying 29, Jesus says, "If the flesh came into being because of spirit, it is a wonder. But if spirit came into being because of the body, it is a wonder of wonders." Then he adds, "I am amazed at how this great wealth has made its home in this poverty." That is not simple hatred of matter. The body is called poverty. Yes, it is fragile, temporary, hungry, vulnerable to pain, disease, aging and death. Anyone living in the ancient world where a fever could kill a child and a bad harvest could destroy a village needed no lecture on the weakness of flesh. But the saying also calls the situation a wonder. Spirit in body is not merely a cosmic mistake. It is an astonishing mystery, great wealth somehow dwelling in poverty. Something luminous hidden inside, something mortal, and that changes the whole picture. Maybe Thomas is not asking its readers to despise the body. Maybe it is asking them to stop mistaking the body for the whole person. That distinction mattered deeply in early Christian life. Across the first centuries of Christianity, many believers practiced fasting, sexual renunciation, voluntary poverty, long periods of prayer, and withdrawal from ordinary social expectations. Some gave away property. Some remained unmarried. Some moved into deserts. Some lived in communities built around discipline and shared possessions. They did not all agree on why. For some, asceticism was preparation for the coming kingdom. For others, it was imitation of Jesus. For others, it was a way of resisting desire, pride, violence, and greed. And for some groups closer to the world of Thomas, detachment may have meant refusing to let the visible order define what was real. The body was not necessarily evil, but attachment could be. That is a very different claim. Think about the difference between saying food is evil and saying hunger can control you. Between saying wealth is evil and saying wealth can make you blind. Between saying the body is evil and saying fear of death can rule your entire life. Thomas repeatedly attacks blindness. People see but do not perceive. They live in the middle of the kingdom but cannot recognize it. They search outside themselves for what is already within and outside them. They become drunk on the world, distracted by its promises, unable to see the light. So when Thomas calls the world a corpse, it may not be giving a scientific statement about creation. It may be describing the world as experienced by someone who has not awakened. A world without recognition is dead. A body without spirit is dead. A life built only around acquiring, consuming, fearing, competing and dying is dead. even while it is still moving. That would fit one of Thomas's strangest paradoxes. The kingdom is not somewhere else. It is not waiting beyond the stars after the destruction of matter. It is spread out upon the earth, and people do not see it. How can the world be a corpse if the kingdom is spread across the earth? Maybe because Thomas is talking about two ways of seeing the same reality. One person sees only objects, bodies, money, power, food, sex, death, one decaying thing after another. Another person sees the hidden light. The first is trapped in the world. The second sees through it, but not necessarily away from it. This is why contempt for the world does not automatically prove that Thomas taught a full Gnostic cosmology. The text never says an evil demiurge made matter. It never identifies the creator of Genesis as a hostile lesser god. It never lays out the machinery of souls falling from heaven and escaping through secret celestial gates. Those ideas existed in other ancient texts, but Thomas does not explain the world that way. Instead, it gives warnings, it gives riddles. It tells the reader to fast from the world, renounce it, become a passerby, and discover what remains when ordinary attachments lose their power. Maybe the real enemy in Thomas is not creation. Maybe it is possession. The need to own the world, to be owned by the body, to confuse temporary things with ultimate things, to look at a living universe and see only a corpse. And if that is true, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What happens when Thomas turns this same radical vision toward the people closest to Jesus himself? And that brings us to the final saying of the Gospel of Thomas. It is only a few lines long, but those few lines have caused more arguments than almost anything else in the entire text. Saying 114 begins with Peter. "Let Mary leave us," he says, "for women are not worthy of life." Then Jesus answers him, "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." And then the Gospel of Thomas ends. No explanation, no scene afterward, no resurrection appearance, no final blessing, no account of what Mary says, whether Peter accepts it, or what making her male could possibly mean. Just that. It is a strange ending for a strange gospel, and it forces modern readers into a world whose symbols do not map neatly onto our own. At the most obvious level, the saying is deeply troubling. Peter dismisses Mary because she is a woman. Jesus does not simply reply, "Peter, women are equally worthy of life." He uses language that appears, at least on the surface, to accept a hierarchy between male and female. Mary must somehow be made male in order to enter the kingdom. That has led some readers to see saying 114 as evidence that Thomas preserved an ancient Christian movement with a fundamentally negative view of women. And that possibility cannot just be waved away. The ancient Mediterranean world was overwhelmingly patriarchal. Political authority, legal rights, inheritance, public speech, religious leadership, and education were usually controlled by men. Women did exercise influence in households, associations, patronage networks, and some religious communities. But they did so within a social order that often treated male authority as normal and female authority as suspicious. Early Christianity emerged inside that world. Its texts contain both radical openings and sharp restrictions. Women appear as disciples, patrons, prophets, martyrs, missionaries, and teachers. But other passages tell women to be silent, submissive, or excluded from authority. Thomas may preserve that same conflict in one compressed and cryptic exchange. Peter says Mary should leave. Jesus refuses. That part matters. Mary is not cast out. She is not told that she is incapable of life. Jesus says he will lead her. She will become a living spirit. She will enter the kingdom. So the saying may be doing something more complicated than simple exclusion. But exactly what it is doing remains fiercely debated. One interpretation sees male and female here as symbolic categories rather than biological ones. In several ancient philosophical and religious traditions, male could be associated with spirit, stability, unity, activity, and wholeness. Female could be associated with matter, division, passivity, and mortality. Those associations were not neutral. They reflected the gender assumptions of the ancient world. But they also meant that language about becoming male could sometimes describe spiritual transformation, not literal masculinity. Under this reading, Jesus is not telling Mary to become a man. He is telling her to overcome the divided condition of ordinary human life. Remember the language Thomas has already used. Make the two one. Make inner like outer. Make above like below. Transform division into unity. Recover the image that existed before separation. Perhaps making Mary male belongs to that same symbolic world. Not male as in socially dominant, male as in undivided, whole, awakened, no longer defined by the fragile categories of the visible world. But there is a problem. If that is all the saying means, why is Peter's attack aimed specifically at Mary as a woman? Why does the text say that women must become male, rather than saying that all people must move beyond male and female? Some scholars think the saying preserves a real struggle over authority inside an early Christian community. Peter, in later Christian memory, became the great apostolic leader, the rock on which the church was built. Mary Magdalene, meanwhile, appears in the canonical Gospels as a follower of Jesus, and crucially, as one of the first witnesses to the resurrection. That was an extraordinary role. In the Gospel of John, Mary Magdalene encounters the risen Jesus before the male disciples do. She is sent to tell them what she has seen. Later Christian tradition would call her apostle to the apostles, and outside the New Testament, Mary's importance sometimes becomes even more striking. In the Gospel of Mary, a text probably written in the 2nd century, Mary comforts the frightened disciples after Jesus departs. She shares teaching that she says she received from the Saviour. Peter challenges her. Could Jesus really have spoken privately with a woman? Would he have preferred her over the male disciples? Another disciple, Levi, defends her. If the Saviour considered her worthy, he says, who is Peter to reject her? That is not the gospel of Thomas. We should not pretend the two texts are identical or assume they came from the same group. But the pattern is hard to miss. Mary receives insight. Peter objects. A dispute breaks out over who has the right to speak for Jesus. Similar tensions appear in other non-canonical Christian writings, including Pistis Sophia and the Dialogue of the Saviour, where Mary is portrayed as unusually perceptive, capable of asking penetrating questions and understanding hidden teaching. This does not prove that there was one organised Mary Magdalene Church, battling one organised Peter Church. Ancient Christianity was never that simple. These texts were written in different places, at different times, by communities we cannot fully reconstruct. But they do show that Mary could become a powerful symbol. For some Christians, she represented faithful witness, spiritual understanding, and authority not based on male office. For others, that possibility may have been unsettling, and that may be why Thomas ends where it does. The final saying may be staging a conflict that its readers already knew. Peter voices exclusion. Jesus reverses the exclusion, but in language shaped by the symbolic hierarchies of the age. Mary is not denied the kingdom, yet her inclusion is described as transformation into what the text calls male. That is both an opening and a limitation. It opens the door to Mary, but it does not fully dismantle the categories Peter uses against her. And we need to be careful here. One cryptic saying cannot tell us exactly how the community behind Thomas treated actual women. We do not know whether women taught in its gatherings, led prayers, interpreted sayings, or held authority over men. We do not know whether this passage was meant as a defense of women, a spiritual allegory, a compromise, or a fragment of an argument whose larger context has vanished. The Gospel of Thomas gives us no footnotes, no community rulebook, no list of leaders, no explanation from its author. It gives us Peter, Mary, Jesus, and a riddle. Maybe that is why saying 114 has never stopped disturbing readers. It is the last door in the text, and it does not open cleanly. Instead, it leaves us standing between two possibilities. On one side, a harsh ancient hierarchy that marks women as less worthy. On the other, a radical claim that the kingdom belongs to those who transcend every division, even the divisions that seem built into the human world. And perhaps Thomas wants its reader to feel the tension, because the Gospel has been asking this question from the beginning. What are you really beneath the names, roles, bodies, fears and divisions that the world has taught you to obey? But then another question follows. If Thomas preserves sayings this strange, this difficult, and this different from the familiar Gospel story, could some of them be older than the written Gospels themselves? That question has haunted the Gospel of Thomas ever since scholars began taking it seriously. Could this strange collection, copied in Coptic around the 4th century, preserve words that circulated before Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John were written? At first, the idea sounds impossible. The complete manuscript was buried in Egypt for more than 1,500 years. It was discovered beside texts with elaborate myths, heavenly beings, secret revelations and teachings that seem far removed from the Galilean teacher familiar from the New Testament. But the manuscript is not the same thing as the book. A 4th century copy can preserve a 2nd century text. A 2nd century text can preserve a 1st century tradition. And a 1st century tradition can preserve words remembered, reshaped, argued over, and passed from person to person long before anyone wrote them down. That is the central possibility, not that Thomas must be older than the canonical Gospels. Most scholars do not think the collection as we have it is earlier in its final form, but some individual sayings within it may be very old. They may come from streams of oral tradition that developed alongside the traditions eventually used by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Think of early Christianity not as one river flowing neatly from Jesus to one authorized set of books. Think of it as a floodplain. Stories, parables, aphorisms, arguments, prayers, memories, and interpretations spread through villages, homes, marketplaces, synagogues, and house churches. Some were repeated by travelling teachers. Some were translated from Aramaic into Greek. Some were adapted for new communities, some were written down. Some were lost, some survived only as fragments inside later texts. The Gospel of Thomas may be one of those places where older material remains embedded inside a later collection. There are sayings in Thomas that sound very close to sayings in the Synoptic Gospels. The parable of the mustard seed is there. The parable of the vineyard owner and the murderous tenants is there. Jesus speaks about a city built on a high hill, about the difficulty of serving two masters, about seeking and finding. And sometimes Thomas preserves these sayings in a shorter form. That matters because shorter sayings can look more primitive. A brief, sharp line can feel like the kind of memorable teaching a real person might repeat in public. Later writers, the argument goes, may have added explanations, narrative settings, theological interpretation, and guidance for their own communities. Maybe Thomas gives us the stripped-down version. Maybe Matthew and Luke give us expanded versions. But here is where the mystery gets difficult. Simple does not automatically mean early. A later editor can shorten a saying, just as easily as an earlier tradition can preserve it. In fact, a collection built around secret wisdom might deliberately remove context. It might take a saying that once appeared in a story, detach it from the story, and turn it into a riddle for readers to interpret. Imagine someone taking a long conversation from a book, cutting out one cryptic line, and placing it by itself on a page. The line now looks ancient, pure, unfiltered, but it may actually be the result of editing. This is one of the biggest traps in the Thomas debate. Scholars cannot simply count words and declare the shortest version the oldest. History is not that cooperative. So how do they judge? They look for patterns. Does a saying fit what we know of first-century Jewish life in Galilee and Judea? Does its language sound as if it may have come from Aramaic speech before being translated into Greek? Does it contain ideas that make better sense before later Christian debates emerged? Is it awkward for the church that preserved it, suggesting it was not invented to support a later agenda? They also compare versions closely. If Thomas and the canonical Gospels share a saying, did Thomas likely copy one of them? Did it use a harmony of several Gospels? Or do all of them seem to draw on earlier oral traditions that no longer survive in written form? Sometimes the answer seems relatively clear. Thomas appears to know forms of sayings that resemble material in Matthew and Luke. In a few cases, its wording may reflect developments associated with later Christianity, a more mystical emphasis on hidden knowledge, a sharper contrast between awakened insiders and the uncomprehending world, language that seems shaped by the theological concerns of the 2nd century. But other sayings resist easy classification. Take the saying, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you." If you do not have that within you, what you do not have within you will kill you. That does not sound exactly like anything in the New Testament. It could preserve an independent memory of Jesus. It could be a later meditation written in Jesus' voice. It could contain an old core transformed by generations of interpretation. We do not have enough evidence to force a verdict. And that is not a failure. That is the actual condition of the evidence. The earliest followers of Jesus lived in an oral world. They remembered teachings by repeating them, but oral tradition is not a tape recorder. Every repetition preserves something and changes something. A saying can remain recognizable for decades while gaining new phrasing, new symbolism, and new meaning. So Thomas may not be one thing, it may be a layered collection. Some sayings could be close to early traditions also found in the Synoptic Gospels. Some may preserve independent versions of those traditions. Some may be later compositions. Some may be old sayings that have been placed beside newer interpretations until the boundaries between them became impossible to see. A box of ancient coins can contain pieces minted under different emperors. The box has one owner. The coins have different histories. That may be Thomas. And this means its historical value does not depend on proving that the entire Gospel was written in the year 50, or that every line goes directly back to Jesus without alteration. Those claims go far beyond what the evidence can establish. Thomas matters even if it is mostly 2nd century. It matters because it shows us that Christians were preserving and interpreting Jesus' words in ways the canonical Gospels do not. It matters because some of its sayings may carry echoes of very early tradition. And it matters because the uncertainty itself reveals something profound. Before Christianity became a library with fixed boundaries, it was a living argument over memory. What did Jesus say? What did he mean? Who understood him? And who had the authority to decide? The Gospel of Thomas does not settle those questions. It makes them impossible to ignore. And that brings us to the question behind every buried gospel. If the Gospel of Thomas mattered to some Christians, if it may preserve ancient traditions, if its sayings were copied, translated, and carried across generations, then why did it not become part of the New Testament? The simple answer is that the Church rejected it. But the real answer is more complicated. There was no single day when bishops gathered in one room, put Thomas on a table and voted to throw it out. No emperor issued a decree ordering every copy buried in the Egyptian desert. No single church authority controlled every Christian community in the first centuries. The New Testament canon developed slowly, unevenly. Through argument, use, memory, and time, for the first generations after Jesus, there was no New Testament as we know it. There were Jewish scriptures, remembered teachings, letters sent between communities, stories about Jesus, prayers, sermons, and collections of sayings. Different churches had different books. A community in Rome might read texts that a community in Syria had never seen. Egyptian Christians might preserve writings that sounded unfamiliar, even dangerous to Christians in Gaul or North Africa. Early Christianity was not one institution with one library. It was a network of communities, scattered across the Roman world, trying to decide what they had received and what they could trust. Over time, certain writings became more widely accepted. The 4 canonical Gospels, the letters of Paul, Acts, and eventually other texts, came to occupy a special position. But that happened because these books met several overlapping tests. The first was apostolic association. Was this text believed to come from an apostle or from someone close to one? Matthew was linked to an apostle. John was linked to an apostle. Mark was traditionally connected with Peter, Luke with Paul. Whether modern historians agree with every one of those traditional attributions is another question. What mattered is that many early Christians believed these texts stood close to the apostolic generation. Thomas had a powerful name attached to it too. Its opening line identifies it as the secret sayings Jesus spoke, and Didymos Judas Thomas recorded. And Thomas was not an obscure figure. In Syriac-speaking Christianity especially, Thomas became an important apostolic hero, remembered as a missionary associated with the East. But a famous name on a title was not enough. By the 2nd century, many Christian writings claimed apostolic authority. There were Gospels associated with Peter, Philip, Mary, Matthias, Judas, and others. Church leaders had to ask a harder question. Was this book genuinely connected to apostolic tradition, or was an apostle's name being used to give authority to a later text? Most scholars today do not think the Gospel of Thomas was written directly by the historical apostle Thomas. Its final form appears to reflect a later period, probably in the 2nd century, though individual sayings may be older. Ancient Christians who doubted it were not making a modern scholarly argument about dating and literary layers. They were making an argument about trust. They did not see Thomas as a secure witness from the apostolic age. Then there was widespread use. A book could not become scripture simply because one group loved it. It had to circulate broadly. It had to be read in communities separated by geography, language, and local custom. The 4 Gospels gained that kind of reach remarkably early. By the late 2nd century, writers such as Irenaeus were already defending the idea that there were 4 authoritative Gospels, no more and no less. Thomas did circulate. We know that because Greek fragments survived at Oxyrhynchus, and because a complete Coptic version was copied into the Nag Hammadi codices. But surviving copies do not necessarily mean universal use. A text can be treasured by one network and barely known in another. Think of it like this. One song can become the anthem of an entire country. Another can be deeply meaningful to a few towns, passed down by families, sung for centuries, and still never enter the national memory. Thomas appears to have been that second kind of text. Some early church writers knew of books associated with Thomas. Around the early 3rd century, Origen included a gospel according to Thomas among writings outside the accepted 4. Hippolytus described a group known as the Naasines using a saying attributed to Thomas. Later writers, including Eusebius and Cyril of Jerusalem, mentioned Thomas among texts they regarded with suspicion or associated with groups they considered outside orthodox teaching. But notice what this tells us. They knew it existed. They knew Christians were reading it, and they were worried about how it was being used. That brings us to the most important factor: theological compatibility. The emerging Catholic, meaning universal, Church was not only collecting ancient books, it was defining a shared public faith. Jesus was understood as the crucified and risen Messiah. Creation was the work of one good God. Salvation involved not merely private enlightenment, but baptism, communal worship, moral transformation, resurrection, and hope for the renewal of the world. Thomas could be read in ways that fit parts of that picture. It speaks of the kingdom, discipleship, seeking, finding, and transformation. Some of its sayings resemble material in Matthew and Luke, but it could also be read very differently. It contains no passion narrative, no account of Jesus dying on the cross, no resurrection appearance, no story of baptism, Eucharist, apostolic mission, or final judgment in the familiar canonical sense. Its Jesus often speaks as a revealer of hidden understanding. The kingdom is not mainly approaching in the future. It is already present, concealed in plain sight, waiting to be recognized. For communities emphasizing sacrament, public preaching, and the bodily resurrection of the dead that could feel incomplete at best and threatening at worst. Not because every reader of Thomas believed the same thing. They clearly did not, but because the text was open to interpretations that church leaders increasingly opposed. Interpretations in which salvation belonged to those who possessed secret insight, the material world was treated as a trap, or the public message of the apostles became secondary to hidden teachings for spiritual elites. And the church was trying to draw boundaries. This was not only theology, it was history. Books that were read aloud in worship gained authority. Books quoted by respected teachers gained authority. Books copied across regions gained authority. Books that seemed consistent with the rule of faith gained authority. Other books remained local, disputed, or suspect. Some disappeared. Some survived in monasteries, private collections, and communities whose forms of Christianity later lost the struggle for influence. By the 4th century, the boundaries became clearer. Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, listed the same 27 books that now form the New Testament in a letter written in 367. Regional church councils later affirmed similar lists. But even then, the canon was not created from nothing. It was recognizing a pattern that had been taking shape for generations. So Thomas was not excluded because one person hid it. It was excluded because it did not become part of the broad, public, liturgical, apostolically anchored Christianity that eventually defined the New Testament. Other Christians preserved it anyway. They copied it, read it, reflected on it, buried it, perhaps, when keeping such books became dangerous or unnecessary. And that is why its rediscovery matters. The Gospel of Thomas is not simply a forbidden book locked outside Christianity. It is evidence that Christianity once contained more voices than the canon preserved. And once that buried voice came back into the light, it changed the conversation. Not because the Gospel of Thomas suddenly replaced Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It did not. Not because scholars discovered a secret file proving that everything Christians had believed for 2,000 years was a lie. They did not, but because Nag Hammadi made one fact impossible to ignore. Early Christianity was more diverse than many people had imagined. Before the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in 1945, scholars already knew that ancient Christianity contained competing movements. Church fathers had written angrily about heretics, false teachers, secret books, and rival interpretations. But those reports mostly came from the winners. They were descriptions written by opponents, often centuries after the arguments had begun. It is one thing to hear a bishop say, "Those people believed strange things." It is another thing to hold the book those people copied, read, and preserved. Nag Hammadi gave scholars texts from the other side of the argument. Not a complete map of every early Christian community, not a perfect archive of lost Christianity, but a window. A real window into worlds of thought that had survived mostly as accusations in the writings of their enemies. And Thomas became the most famous window of all. Why Thomas? Because it is strange enough to feel hidden, but familiar enough to feel possible. Open it, and Jesus is there. He speaks of the kingdom. He speaks of disciples. He speaks of finding, seeking, becoming, and seeing. Some sayings sound almost exactly like material in the New Testament. Others sound like they came from a different universe. Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there. The kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and people do not see it. For mystics, Thomas can feel like a spiritual depth charge. It seems to suggest that the divine is not far away, locked behind death, judgment, or institutional authority. It is hidden in the ordinary world, in the self, in the act of waking up. For skeptics, it can look like evidence that the familiar Christian story was only one version among many. A version that became dominant because it had power, organization, and eventually imperial support. For historians, it is something more complicated and in some ways more valuable. It is evidence that early followers of Jesus collected sayings, evidence that different communities could understand Jesus in radically different ways, evidence that the boundaries of Christianity were still being argued over long after the first generation of believers had died. And for conspiracy-minded audiences, Thomas is almost irresistible. A gospel hidden in the desert, secret sayings, a church that rejected it, a Jesus who seems to speak about inner knowledge rather than sin, sacrifice and salvation through the cross. You can see why the story catches fire. It has all the ingredients: lost truth, suppressed knowledge, powerful institutions, ancient mysteries buried in sand for 16 centuries. But this is exactly where caution matters, because a buried book is not automatically a banned truth. A text outside the canon is not automatically more authentic than the texts inside it. And a text that uses the word secret is not necessarily reporting a conspiracy. In the ancient world, secret teaching could mean many things. It could mean wisdom for committed disciples, symbolic interpretation, ritual instruction, a claim that spiritual truth had to be discovered rather than merely heard. The Gospel of Thomas does not come with a label saying, "Here is what really happened." It comes with 114 sayings, many of them difficult, some of them familiar, some of them unsettling, and almost all of them demanding interpretation. That ambiguity is its power, and it is also the danger. People often look at ancient silence and hear certainty. If Thomas does not mention the crucifixion, some conclude it must preserve a Christianity before anyone cared about the cross. But silence can mean many things. Thomas is a sayings collection. It does not tell stories in the first place. Its silence about an event does not prove that the event was unknown to its author or readers. Others see a saying shared with Matthew or Luke and conclude Thomas must be earlier than both. Maybe, but not necessarily. Similarity can come from an earlier shared tradition, direct borrowing, oral memory, or later adaptation. Ancient texts are not neat family trees. They are more like rivers crossing, dividing, joining again, carrying old material into new landscapes. This is what Thomas genuinely changes. It does not overturn all Christian history. It overturns a simpler story of Christian history. The simple story says there was one original Christianity clearly defined from the beginning, and everything outside it was a late corruption. Thomas makes that harder to maintain, but the opposite simple story is no better. The idea that Thomas reveals the one true Jesus, while the canonical Gospels are merely the winner's propaganda, is also too neat. History is rarely that generous. The earliest Christian world was not a battle between pure truth and total deception. It was a crowded, evolving landscape of memory, argument, worship, storytelling, and competing claims about what Jesus meant. Thomas belongs inside that landscape, not above it, not beneath it, inside it. And maybe that is why it still unsettles people. The canonical Gospels give us narratives. They take Jesus from birth, or beginning, toward death and resurrection. They tell us what happened, who followed, who failed, who betrayed, who wept, who ran, and what the followers claimed came next. Thomas gives us almost no shelter like that, no plot to hold on to, no clear explanation after every riddle, just sayings, a voice, a challenge. If you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. That is not a sentence you can simply agree with and move on. You have to ask what within means. Is it the image of God? Hidden wisdom, moral transformation, a divine spark, a dangerous illusion of self-salvation? Different readers have answered differently for nearly 2,000 years. And perhaps that is the modern Thomas mystery. Not that it gives us a secret answer to the beginning of humanity, but that it keeps exposing how badly we want one. A single lost gospel, a single hidden truth, a final explanation for where we came from, who we are, and what Jesus really taught. Thomas refuses to make it that easy. It survives as a collection of doors. And every saying asks the same question. Will you merely read the words? Or will you search for what they are asking you to see? And that may be the most honest place to leave the Gospel of Thomas. Not with a solved mystery, not with a secret history of Christianity finally uncovered, but with a book that has survived because it refuses to stop asking questions. Think about what we actually know. Sometime in the 4th century, a group of Egyptian Christians or spiritual seekers placed a collection of books in a jar near Nag Hammadi. They buried them in the dry earth, perhaps for safety, perhaps because the religious world around them was changing fast and dangerous texts could become dangerous possessions. 16 centuries later, those books came back. Among them was the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. No birth story, no journey to Jerusalem, no trial before Pilate, no crucifixion scene, no empty tomb, just words, one after another, sometimes familiar, sometimes cryptic, sometimes so strange they seem designed to resist easy understanding. This is the secret saying which the living Jesus spoke and which Didymos Judas Thomas wrote down. That opening line has created arguments that are still going on today. Did Thomas really write it? Almost certainly not in the simple modern sense. The name Thomas may be an apostolic claim, a way of connecting the text to the disciple remembered in Syrian Christian tradition. Thomas means twin, and in some ancient traditions, Thomas becomes the twin of Jesus. Not necessarily biologically, but spiritually, symbolically, mysteriously. Was the text written early? Some of its sayings may preserve very old traditions, sayings that circulated orally before any gospel was written down. Some may have developed alongside the traditions later found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Others may reflect later theological debates, later language, later ways of imagining Jesus and salvation. Scholars still disagree. Some place the core of Thomas in the 1st century, perhaps close to the earliest gospel traditions. Others see it as a 2nd century collection, shaped by communities that had already begun interpreting Jesus in more mystical or esoteric ways. And many scholars take a middle position. They see Thomas as a layered text. Old sayings, new sayings, remembered sayings, reshaped sayings, all gathered together over time, like a river carrying water from many sources. And that matters because people often want ancient texts to be simple. Earlier means truer, later means false. Canonical means authentic. Non-canonical means suppressed. But history does not work that cleanly. A text can preserve early material and still be edited later. A canonical gospel can be deeply rooted in early tradition and still reflect the concerns of the community that wrote it. A lost gospel can be fascinating, spiritually powerful, and historically important without being a secret transcript from the first disciples. Thomas is difficult because it will not fit into the categories we want to give it. And maybe that is exactly the point, because the Gospel of Thomas does not really offer a different creation story in the normal sense. It does not begin with God making the heavens and the earth. It does not retell Genesis from the beginning. It does not give us a new Adam and Eve narrative with different names, different gardens, or a hidden explanation of how humanity first entered the world. Its challenge is more subtle than that. It asks us to imagine human origins differently. Not necessarily biologically, not scientifically, not as alternative to evolution, archaeology, or genetics. But spiritually, what if the deepest human problem is not that we came from matter, but that we have forgotten what we are? What if creation is not only something that happened at the beginning of time, but something that is still happening inside consciousness? What if the lost paradise is not a location behind us, but a condition of division? That is where Thomas keeps returning. The kingdom is hidden, but it is already here. The kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and people do not see it. That is one of the most radical ideas in the entire collection. The kingdom is not simply waiting beyond death. It is not only a future event when history ends and God finally intervenes. In Thomas, the kingdom is present, concealed in plain sight, waiting to be recognized. And the problem is not distance, it is blindness. Then there is the image. Thomas speaks again and again in the language of seeing, knowing, finding, becoming. Human beings appear to carry something hidden within them, something connected to their origin. Some readers call it the divine image, others call it the light. Others see it as wisdom, self-knowledge, transformation, or the recovery of a true relationship with God. But Thomas does not define it for us in a neat theological formula. It gives us riddles. If you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. That can sound like salvation by inner knowledge, and maybe that is how some ancient readers understood it. But it can also be read as a demand for honesty, a demand to confront what is buried beneath fear, status, habit, shame, and imitation. To bring forth what is within you might mean discovering a divine spark, or it might mean becoming whole. And Thomas is obsessed with wholeness. Make the two one. That strange command appears in different forms throughout the text. Male and female, inner and outer, above and below, image and reality, the divided self and the unified self. For some interpreters, this is a mystical return to an original human unity before the divisions described in Genesis. For others, it is symbolic language, a call to reconcile the contradictions inside us. The self we show the world and the self we hide, the body and the spirit, knowledge and action, what we claim to believe and how we actually live. Maybe Thomas is asking whether humanity's beginning was not simply a moment in the distant past. Maybe it is asking whether the beginning is still inside us, whether we are living after a fall or inside one, whether awakening means escaping the world or finally learning to see the world clearly. And this is why calling Thomas Gnostic can be useful but incomplete. Yes, it shares themes that later became associated with Gnostic thought: hidden knowledge, divine origins, awakening, the unreliability of ordinary perception. But Thomas does not map perfectly onto one system. It does not give us a detailed myth of evil creators, cosmic prisons, and salvation through secret passwords. Its relationship with the material world is complicated. Its relationship with the body is complicated. Its relationship with the church is complicated. Everything about it is complicated. That is not a weakness in the evidence. That is the evidence. We have a buried manuscript, copied centuries after Jesus lived. We have Greek fragments that may point toward an earlier form of the text. We have sayings that resemble the canonical Gospels and sayings that do not. We have a name attached to the work, but no confident proof of authorship. We have clues, patterns, probabilities, arguments built from tiny pieces of surviving history, and there are limits to what anyone can honestly claim. We cannot say with confidence that Thomas gives us the earliest version of Jesus. We cannot say with confidence that it was invented late and has no early memories at all. We cannot say that it reveals a lost original Christianity. We cannot say it was merely a strange distortion of the real thing. What we can say is that it preserves a real ancient attempt to answer questions that have never gone away. Where is God? What are human beings? Why do we feel divided? What have we forgotten? And what would it mean to wake up? Maybe the buried sayings are not asking us to abandon history. Maybe they are asking us to be more humble before it, to admit that the past is larger, stranger, and less settled than the stories we prefer. And maybe they are asking something even more uncomfortable. What if the kingdom is not hidden because it is far away? What if it is hidden because we have learned not to see it? So what do you think? Which saying from the Gospel of Thomas challenges you the most, confuses you the most, or feels like it might be pointing towards something real? Share your interpretation in the comments and tell us where you are listening from. If you enjoyed this journey into one of Christianity's most mysterious buried texts, please like the video, comment and subscribe for more. And the best way to support the channel is to listen on Spotify through the link in the description.